Hey guys, tonight we are cracking open a gilded, pearl-clasped door into a side of royalty they never covered in your history class. The side with secret passageways, scandalous love letters, forbidden liaisons, and the kind of political pillow talk that could ignite wars. Welcome to the shocking lust of kings, where crowns and corsets collide. Trust me, by the end of this journey you're going to wonder how any of these monarchs had time for actual ruling. And just a fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Emotionally, that is. You'll meet kings with harems, queens accused of sleeping with their siblings, emperors who hosted orgies in marble halls, and at least one royal who commissioned a custom-built sex chair. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your city and what time you're listening. I love seeing where and when you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start by stepping back through time, way back into the silk-lined shadows of ancient courts, where the line between love, lust, and political manipulation blurred with every passing glance. The truth is, ruling dynasties weren't built solely on alliances and warfare. More often than not, they were built on whispered promises in candlelit bedrooms. Passion was power, and beds were battlegrounds. For kings and queens, marriage was rarely about love. It was about treaties, land, bloodlines, and keeping the money and control in the family. So what did these royals do when they wanted something a little more enjoyable? That's where mistresses, secret affairs, and shadowy lovers crept in. Unofficial consorts who wielded just as much power as ministers, generals, or even spouses. Some of these affairs were consensual, sweet, and even tender. Others were darker, rooted in coercion, obsession, or raw political ambition. You'll come to see that royal bedrooms were often just as dangerous as royal thrones, maybe more so. Let's start with the grand stage of Europe. In almost every European monarchy, sex was both a privilege and a liability. Royals were expected to produce heirs, preferably male, and quickly, but that biological mission came with intense public scrutiny. Court physicians, advisors, and noble families were all in your business, literally. In France, royal births were performed in front of witnesses to prevent any switching of babies. Privacy? Forget it. And yet, behind closed doors, especially once the candles were blown out, kings and queens let loose. Secret passageways connected bedrooms. Servants were bribed to look the other way. Love letters passed through lace gloves and gloved hands. Lust wasn't just tolerated, it was expected, provided you kept up appearances. And in that tension, scandal thrived. You'll notice patterns. Kings like Louis XIV and Charles II kept entire miniature courts of mistresses, with rotating favourites, each rewarded with estates and titles. Meanwhile, queens like Elizabeth I and Catherine the Great faced much sharper scrutiny. For them, any hint of romance, real or invented, could be used to discredit their power. That double standard is one of history's longest-standing hypocrisies. Now don't get the wrong idea, this isn't just a list of who slept with whom. That would be far too simple. No, what makes these stories worth staying up for is the impact they had. Some of these affairs shaped diplomacy, some sparked war, others toppled entire dynasties. Royal lust wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. Take, for example, the fringe belief that sexual energy influenced the divine right of kings, and in certain esoteric circles, especially during the Renaissance. Sex wasn't just a pastime, it was a cosmic force. Some monarchs surrounded themselves with astrologers and mystics who swore that certain sexual acts or timings would enhance their power. Imagine planning your coronation around your libido. Stranger things have happened, and will, in the chapter's head. That brings us to a broader debate still raging in historical circles. How much of this is real? Royal propaganda was a weapon, and sexual rumours were among its sharpest blade-edges. Rivals would often spread tales of incest, orgies, or impotence to destroy reputations. Some claims were true, others were fabrications. The trouble is, the line between historical record and gossip is razor thin. Still, those stories, true or not, had power. They shaped how rulers were perceived even centuries later, and they offer us a keyhole view into royal humanity. These weren't just figures in portraits or names in textbooks, they were people, flawed, passionate, scared, and craving connection, control, or sometimes just a warm body beside them in the cold. So as we venture deeper, remember, each monarch you meet tonight made choices that rippled through history. Some used lust as a political tool, others let it become their undoing, and a few, well, they just wanted to have a little fun before bedtime. You ready? We're heading next to Versailles, where the hallways smelled like perfume, the gardens were laced with secret liaisons, and the most powerful man in Europe couldn't keep it in his royal trousers. Versailles glows beneath the gold of the early morning sun, but you're not here for the architecture. You're here for Louis XIV, the Sun King, who not only ruled France with absolute power, but also set a personal world record in bedroom diplomacy. Let's not sugarcoat it, the man had game, and not just some casual one mistress at a time dalliance. No, Louis XIV turned seduction into an institution, literally. There were entire positions at court, unofficial of course, devoted to being his favourite. And those positions rotated almost as often as the seasons. You walk through the grand halls of Versailles, where marble floors echo with the clicks of court shoes and hushed whispers. Behind all the silk and powdered wigs, there's something far more primal happening. Everyone is watching the king not just to obey him but to please him, charm him, sleep with him if they're lucky, or unlucky, depending on how it all played out. Louis had a type, sure, but more than that he had a system. His earliest and most infamous mistress was Louise de la Vallière, a shy, modest woman who genuinely seemed to love him. But of course, in a court built on spectacle, shy and modest only go so far. She was soon pushed aside by the glittering, sharp-tongued Athénaïs de Montespan, a woman so powerful she effectively became queen in all but name, while Louis's actual wife, Maria Teresa of Spain, quietly endured her humiliations. Athénaïs hosted secret rituals, bore the king, several children, and was even implicated in the notorious affair of the poisons. Yes, that affair of the poisons, the one where court ladies were literally accused of using black magic, love potions, and actual poison to eliminate rivals or secure favour. Athénaïs herself was rumoured to have consulted fortune-tellers and sorcerers to keep the king enchanted. Imagine being so high profile in your seduction game that people accuse you of witchcraft. That's either flattery or a felony, possibly both. And yet, her reign as the royal favourite didn't last. Enter Madame de Maintenon, Louis's final and most enduring mistress, who may have secretly become his wife in a morganatic marriage. Maintenon was pious, discreet, and nothing like her flamboyant predecessors. She outlasted them all by playing the long game, offering spiritual guidance, not just sensual pleasure. With her, Louis aged into a kind of half-repentant monogamy, one eye still glancing backward at a life of endless affairs. But it wasn't just about Louis's conquests, it was about the world he created. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a theatre, and the drama was always running. Women and men occasionally vied for his gaze, knowing that a single night with the king could mean lands, titles, or security for life. Some noble families even trained their daughters to attract his attention, coaching them in witty conversation, modest flirtation, and, of course, the fine art of ignoring his current mistress without seeming rude. It was seduction as statecraft, and here's the fringe detail you didn't ask for but are absolutely getting anyway. The beds at Versailles had rules. The king's rising and going to bed rituals were public events, complete with a designated bed called the lit de justice. It wasn't necessarily where he slept, but where court business happened. He had another bed for actual sleeping, and then another one for, let's say, more private meetings. It's possible Louis needed a literal bed chart just to keep it all straight, but beneath all the satin and intrigue, there's a persistent scholarly debate. Did Louis's affairs weaken the state, or did they bizarrely strengthen it? Some historians argue his endless romantic entanglements distracted him from policy, especially during key military campaigns. Others claim the mistresses were part of his policy, extensions of his control. By centralising power at court and keeping the nobility tethered to Versailles, where they fought over access to the royal bedroom instead of launching rebellions, Louis effectively neutralised his rivals. A well-placed mistress could diffuse an entire faction. And there's another layer to consider. Louis publicly acknowledged many of his illegitimate children, especially those with Athénaïs. He arranged noble marriages for them, pulling their bloodlines into the orbit of legitimate power. In doing so, he blurred the line between official and unofficial royalty. France became a court of both legitimate and semi-legitimate heirs, which created political headaches later, but bought him loyalty in the short term. Imagine living in a world where your mother's bedroom prowess determined your noble status. It sounds wild, but for many of Louis's children, that was reality, and they knew it. They played their roles accordingly. Of course, not everyone at court was charmed. His queen, Maria Theresa, suffered greatly, enduring the parade of favourites with barely a protest. It's said she once found her husband with a mistress and left the room quietly, whispering only, "I will not disturb his majesty." Her early death sparked some speculation, heartbreak perhaps, or simply exhaustion from playing the role of invisible spouse in a very visible palace. And yet in death she got the last laugh. Louis never remarried, and the flame of his youth, the one lit by his lovers, dimmed. Even Versailles grew darker, more austere in his final years. The fountains kept dancing, but the music felt quieter, more distant. Still, you can't deny the legacy. Oh, Louis XIV redefined royal seduction. He made it institutional, and the shadow of his lust, equal parts pleasure and strategy, lingers through history like the scent of perfume clinging to heavy drapes. Next, we slip across the channel to another monarch whose bedroom was a battleground. Only this time the rumours whisper of virginity, secret lovers, and a throne balanced on chastity and desire. England is wrapped in fog tonight, thick and whispering, and you find yourself approaching the cold stone towers of an empire on the brink of greatness or disaster, depending on whom you ask. Inside sits a woman wrapped in pearls, pride and riddles, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Her court poets call her a goddess, her advisors call her a stateswoman. But the people, they whisper, and the whispers are hot. She says she's a virgin, says it right to your face with that perfectly arched Tudor brow and a gaze so sharp it could slice through lies. But the truth? You're not getting it. No one ever really did. Because Elizabeth wasn't just a queen. She was a performance, and no part of her act was more powerful or more controversial than the suggestion that she never let anyone share her bed. Let's rewind to her early years. Born to Anne Boleyn, the second of Henry VIII's 6 wives, Elizabeth had a front row seat to just how dangerous it was to be a woman in love with a king. Anne, after all, lost her head, literally, for failing to give Henry a male heir and allegedly cheating on him. That kind of childhood trauma sticks. And Elizabeth? She learned. She saw that marriage wasn't security, it was a trap, especially for a queen. When she finally took the throne in 1558, the pressure to marry was immediate. Foreign princes lined up like suitors on a twisted version of the Bachelor Crown edition. France sent dukes, Spain offered alliances, even English nobles threw their names in. But Elizabeth turned them all away. Her reasoning? She was married to her country. But you can't rule England on chastity alone. And here's where it gets juicy. There was one man who got closer than all the rest, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Childhood friend, master of the horse, constant presence at court. To the outside world, their bond was clear. To insiders, it was downright scandalous. He had chambers near hers. She wore his colours. They danced so often and so long that courtiers whispered their footsteps could lead to a royal scandal. Here's the kicker. Dudley was already married. And in 1560, his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Broken neck, no witness, officially ruled an accident, but suspicion clung to Dudley like a shadow. Others said he killed her to marry the Queen. Others thought it was suicide. A few murmured it was an assassin sent to frame him and destroy his chances. But Elizabeth? She never touched the topic. She distanced herself just enough. Clever, cold, calculated, and still, she kept Dudley close. Now here's your fringe fact. Elizabeth reportedly had a secret bedchamber staff made up entirely of women who were trained not just in courtly manners, but in espionage light. Their job? Observe and report. No man, not even Dudley, could enter without being noticed, questioned, or intercepted. The Queen ran a surveillance state right from her four-poster bed. Still, the rumours never stopped. One of the most persistent came from a former courtier who claimed Elizabeth gave birth in secret. Supposedly, the child was spirited away, raised in the countryside, and later became, wait for it, Francis Bacon. Yes, that Bacon. Philosopher, scientist, possible Shakespeare. This theory is laughable to most scholars, but it's the kind of delicious absurdity that sticks. The idea that the world's most famously celibate monarch had a love child just scratches that itch. We all have for the official story to crack. Oh, poor. And speaking of scholarly debates, this one still rages. Was Elizabeth really a virgin? Some historians believe yes, that her cold political calculus outweighed personal passion, that her life was so bound in duty, she never had a moment to herself, let alone a lover. Others say it's just good branding, that by projecting chastity she could rule as both woman and man and untouchable by marriage, unclaimed by any male authority. Virginity in this case was less about sex and more about sovereignty. And maybe, just maybe, it was both. Maybe Elizabeth used her virgin image as a weapon, a crown and a shield, but behind closed doors, who knows? What's certain is that no queen in history ever wielded her sexuality with such precision by not wielding it at all. She made England her consort, her court, her family, and left a trail of heartbroken suitors across Europe. There's something deeply strategic in that. Her refusal to marry kept foreign powers guessing. If she married France, Spain might declare war. If she chose an Englishman, the nobles would tear each other apart. By staying single, Elizabeth became an enigma, a diplomatic black hole. No one could predict her, and that made her powerful. And let's not forget the sheer theatricality of it all. She wore gowns stitched with eyes and ears to suggest she saw and heard everything. She painted her face in white lead, giving her a ghostly, untouchable aura. Her court was a stage, and she was both lead actress and playwright. Her image was so carefully crafted that by the time she died, even she may not have known where the woman ended and the myth began. But even myths have to sleep sometime. In her final years, Elizabeth became increasingly isolated. She danced less, laughed less. Her teeth blackened, her hair thinned, and she grew terrified of sleep. She'd stay up for nights at a time, pacing her chambers, whispering to shadows. It's said she wouldn't let anyone undress her, as if removing the armour of her image, just for a moment, might expose too much. So did she die a virgin? Maybe, maybe not, but the fact that we still ask the question, that's her true legacy. She turned sexual mystery into political mastery, and left everyone else chasing ghosts. Speaking of ghosts, next up is a queen whose legend refuses to die. They called her wild. They said she died in bed with a horse. But behind the scandal, a woman who conquered more than just gossip. It's cold in St. Petersburg tonight. So cold the marble feels like ice and the chandeliers drip icicles in your imagination. But behind the frosted windows of the Winter Palace there's heat. Not the kind from a fireplace, but the kind that radiates from ambition, desire, and a queen who refused to play by anyone else's rules. You're about to meet Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, enlightened ruler, military strategist, and, if the rumours are to be believed, sexual chaos personified. Let's start by ripping the bandage off. No, she did not die having sex with a horse. That legend, bizarre as it is, was the product of 18th century misogyny, French satirists, and maybe a few jealous courtiers who couldn't handle being outmanoeuvred by a woman who ruled better than most men of her time. But Catherine's real love life? Oh, it was still a tornado. Born a minor German princess named Sophie, Catherine was shipped off to Russia to marry the future Peter III, a man who loved toy soldiers more than women. The marriage was disappointing. Their relationship was so distant that some historians believe they never consummated it at all, which makes it awkward because Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul. The math doesn't quite add up unless you consider the fringe theory that Paul wasn't Peter's child at all, but rather the product of Catherine's first real affair, with a dashing noble named Sergei Saltykov. And that was just the start. Once Catherine seized the throne, after her husband's mysterious and convenient assassination, she didn't just rule, she reigned with passion. Her lovers, known as her favourites, were carefully chosen, lavishly rewarded, and rotated with all the emotional detachments of a CEO switching out executive staff. But don't mistake it for coldness. Catherine didn't take lovers for power. She already had power. She took them for pleasure, for companionship, for intellectual stimulation, sometimes for love, but always on her terms. Take Grigory Orlov, one of her most famous lovers. He helped her stage the coup that overthrew her husband. In return, she gave him titles, estates, and even a palace. He wasn't just her partner in bed, he was her co-conspirator. Their relationship was passionate, scandalous, and surprisingly public. But when the flame cooled, Catherine moved on. No drama, just a smooth transition to the next favoured courtier. Then there was Grigory Potemkin, the man who may have been her true love. A brilliant general, strategist, and deeply flawed romantic, Potemkin shared more than Catherine's bed, he shared her mind. They wrote to each other constantly, often in explicit detail, even after their physical affair ended. Some scholars believe they secretly married. Others argue they didn't need a ceremony to seal what was essentially a royal partnership. Either way, Potemkin remained her closest ally, proof that Catherine could maintain the deep bonds without the legal chains of marriage. Now, let's pause for a fringe fact so bizarre you'll never unknow it. Catherine once had furniture custom-built for her favourite lover's quarters. This included chairs and tables carved with graphic erotic scenes. Not subtle carvings either. We're talking full-on Kama Sutra meets Rococo excess. According to legend, and yes, it's still debated, she kept these pieces in a secret boudoir, perhaps as trophies, perhaps as decor, perhaps because ruling a continent comes with perks like NSFW interior design. Catherine's lovers weren't always noble. She occasionally picked from the military or minor gentry, once choosing a young man 25 years her junior. And yet it never caused a full-blown scandal in Russia the way it would have in France or England. Why? Because Catherine had reshaped the narrative. She was Russia. To criticise her private life was to criticise the empire. That's power. And yet even she wasn't immune to gossip. European courts hated her. Enlightenment thinkers admired her reforms but raised their eyebrows at the speed with which her lovers came and went. Satirists mocked her as insatiable. Political enemies painted her as deviant. And after her death, the infamous horse rumour emerged, a grotesque, calculated smear designed to reduce a brilliant woman to a single salacious image. This brings us to a long-standing academic debate. Was Catherine truly a libertine, or simply a woman living outside of oppressive norms? Some argue her relationships were calculated, a means to reward loyalty and test intimacy in a court where trust was rarer than rubies. Others suggest she was a genuine romantic, constantly seeking the affection her arranged marriage never provided. A few even call her a proto-feminist wielding control over her sexuality as both shield and sword. But here's the truth that matters. Catherine never apologised for who she loved, never hid her pleasure, never let herself be shamed. And in a world where women were supposed to be sent, obedient and invisible, she built an empire around her voice, her body, and her brilliance. By the time she died in 1796, no horse involved, Catherine had transformed Russia into a major European power, expanded its borders, and ushered in a cultural renaissance. Her bedroom may have been full, but so was her library. She corresponded with Voltaire, she reformed laws, she founded schools for girls, and she did it all while wearing silk gowns and choosing lovers like she was drafting an all-star team. So next time you hear someone mention Catherine the Great with a smirk, remind them she didn't die in a scandal, she survived through them, flourished even, and rewrote the rules for women in power along the way. Now, speaking of kings who didn't know how to stop, our next stop takes us back to England, where a monarch known as the Merry Monarch didn't just restore the throne, he restored partying, a lot of partying, and he made sure no bed in Whitehall went untouched. You arrive in Restoration England, where the plague is waning, Puritan rule is dead, and the people are desperate for something, anything resembling joy. Enter Charles II, affectionately and not so subtly, known as the Merry Monarch. If Louis XIV turned seduction into a system, Charles turned it into a sport, one with no rules, endless participants, and the occasional peerage as a party favour. Imagine this, it's 1660, and Charles has just sauntered back onto the throne after years of exile in France. The country, starved for glamour and exhausted from Cromwell's fun-crushing, scripture-wielding dictatorship, wants a king who will laugh, drink, and, frankly, misbehave. Charles delivers, and not just with witty quips and fashionable wigs. No, Charles brings the full royal libido. From the moment he sets foot back in Whitehall, it's clear that this is going to be a different kind of court. The New England is all silk, scandal, and champagne. Well, not actual champagne, it hasn't caught on yet, but something fizzy and probably French. Charles turns the palace into a pleasure dome. Balls, banquets, masquerades and theatre performances abound. And behind the scenes, bedrooms with revolving doors, you could practically hear the upholstery begging for mercy. Charles's official queen, Catherine of Braganza, is a Portuguese princess who does her best to tolerate the whirlwind of mistresses surrounding her husband. Sadly, she can't produce an heir, and this becomes the one thing Charles can't laugh away. But don't worry, he more than makes up for it on the illegitimate side. The man sires at least a dozen children with 7 different women, and those are just the acknowledged ones. It's said he once joked, "I'm the father of my people," and, well, he wasn't exactly lying. Let's meet the star of his harem, Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, later Duchess of Cleveland. She's tall, dark-haired, scandalously outspoken, and utterly unbothered by decorum. Barbara was Charles's chief mistress for years, had 5 of his children, and made no effort to hide her power. She strutted through court like she owned it, which, to be fair, she kind of did. When people complained about her behaviour, Charles simply shrugged and said, "She is my mistress. You must treat her as such." Royal privilege. More like royal immunity. But Barbara was only the beginning. Enter Nell Gwynn, a former orange seller turned actress turned national treasure. Nell was funny, street-smart, and had a working-class charm that even the nobility couldn't deny. She met Charles at the theatre, bantered with him like an equal, and, boom, became one of his favourite mistresses. The public adored her. Once, mistaken for one of the king's more Catholic lovers, she leaned out a carriage window and shouted to a mob, "I'm the Protestant whore." Whore. Iconic. And yes, Charles had a Catholic mistress too, Louise de Keroualle, a French beauty with diplomatic connections and a suspiciously strong perfume budget. She was elegant, calculating, and suspected of being a spy for the French crown. Parliament hated her, but Charles doted on her. He even created a new duchy just to give her a title, because nothing says I love you like a few thousand acres and an annual income. Now for a quirky detour. One of Charles's lesser-known mistresses, Moll Davis, was a singer who once gave the king a particularly memorable performance, in more ways than one. The next morning she was gifted a house, just like that. In fact, Charles was so generous with land, money and titles for his lovers that his court became a kind of informal property market. Sleep with the king, inherit a townhouse, possibly 2, and let's not forget the court itself, which often felt more like a theatrical production than a government. Charles loved plays, especially the ones where actresses wore fewer clothes than absolutely necessary. His patronage of the arts wasn't just cultural, it was personal. Many of his mistresses came from the stage, and he would sometimes sneak backstage to flirt, seduce, or simply enjoy the view. Of course, the scandal didn't stop at the sheets. Charles formally acknowledged several of his illegitimate children and gave them noble titles, Dukes of Monmouth, Grafton, St Albans, and so on. These weren't just casual labels. They came with lands, wealth, and political clout. Some of these offspring would go on to cause significant chaos later. Looking at you, Duke of Monmouth, but Charles seemed entirely unconcerned about the long-term implications of his prolific bedroom diplomacy. That brings us to the academic debate. Was Charles's court a sign of moral decline or necessary healing after a decade of Puritan repression? Some historians argue that the chaos and excess symbolised a cultural rebirth. Others say it was just an unrelenting frat party with royal funding. Still others point out that Charles managed somehow to maintain peace and stability during most of his reign, suggesting that his lust for pleasure didn't interfere too much with his political sensibilities. And yet, beneath the laughter and liaisons, Charles did carry a melancholy. He never got the legitimate heir he needed. His brother James would succeed him, something that deeply worried Parliament since James was Catholic. Charles might have ruled with a grin, but he died with unfinished business, and perhaps a few too many mistresses to fit comfortably into the history books. Still, when Charles II died in 1685, his final words were almost absurdly on brand. "Let not poor Nelly starve." Even on his deathbed, the man was thinking about one of his mistresses. You have to respect the consistency. As the court slipped back into mourning, the perfume of his lovers still lingered in the hallways, and the throne, once filled with laughter and lust, grew cold again. But his legacy, that never cooled. He taught England how to party again, and perhaps more importantly, he reminded the monarchy and the people that a little pleasure, when wielded wisely, could be its own kind of power. Now let's head back across the channel to another royal wife in France. But this one wasn't merry, she was misunderstood, and for centuries they blamed her for decadence, disaster, and a bedroom full of rumours she didn't ask for. Next up, the tragic and tangled sex life of Marie Antoinette. You're in Versailles again. but the gold feels tarnished now. The air is heavier, the music more hollow, and though the mirrors still sparkle in the Hall of Mirrors, they reflect something uneasy. At the centre of this uneasy glare is Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before everything collapsed. History would make her a symbol of excess, of powdered wigs and cake and cruel indifference. But peel back the layers of silk and scandal, and what you'll find is a teenager dropped into a world of ice and fire, whose every move, especially in the bedroom, was picked apart by a nation on the brink. Let's start with this. She was just 14 years old when she married the Dauphin Louis Auguste, awkward, anxious, and already painfully aware that the entire future of France's monarchy depended on her womb. Their union was political, of course. An alliance between Austria and France meant to cement peace and stability. But behind the trumpets and tapestries, the whispers began almost immediately, because they weren't doing it. Yes, for nearly 7 years their marriage remained unconsummated. The palace gossiped, pamphlets mocked them, European courts snickered, and poor Marie, a teenager turned queen, was cast as either frigid, defective, or, more cruelly, already secretly experienced and too bored by her husband to bother. The pressure was immense. Louis XVI was reportedly shy, insecure, and possibly suffering from a condition called phimosis, a painful issue that may have prevented intercourse. But try explaining that to a French mob. All they saw was a foreign woman living in luxury, and failing to do the one job she was brought there to do, produce heirs. And here's where things got strange. Marie Antoinette's private life, or what the public imagined was her private life, became the focus of a full-blown cultural obsession. Anonymous pamphlets, called Rebel, flooded Paris, describing her in lurid, graphic detail. She was accused of lesbian affairs, orgies, incest, infidelity, and pretty much any perversion the authors could dream up. The most infamous of these leaflets portrayed her cavorting with multiple lovers, including her own brother-in-law, and even female courtiers. Some depictions went so far as to claim she held depraved rituals in secret palace rooms, complete with masks, whips, and all the softcore gothic horror you'd expect from an 18th century tabloid. Was any of it true? Probably not. Or more precisely, it was exaggerated to absurdity. But here's the catch. Marie's actual behaviour did give people ammunition. Frustrated by her cold marriage and lack of agency, she poured herself into fashion, parties and close friendships. Her most intimate bond was with the dazzling Princess de Lamballe, a relationship so emotionally intense it immediately raised eyebrows. Lamballe became her constant companion, her confidant, her emotional support in a palace full of vipers. Did they have a romantic or sexual relationship? The historical evidence is frustratingly vague, but the rumours, those were very, very loud. And then came Count Axel von Fersen, the tall, dashing Swedish nobleman with cheekbones sharp enough to cut through diplomatic protocol. He arrived at Versailles with military flair and Nordic charm. And the chemistry between him and Marie was palpable. They exchanged affectionate letters, some coded, some openly flirty, and he remained fiercely loyal to her until the very end. Historians are still split on whether their relationship was consummated. Some believe they were lovers, others argue it was an unconsummated but deeply emotional affair. Either way, it gave the Rebel writers fresh blood to work with. And for the French public, starving in the streets while their queen was allegedly getting Swedish massages, it was enough to turn irritation into hatred. Here's your fringe fact. In one particularly unhinged Rebel, Marie Antoinette was accused of performing unnatural acts with a mechanical contraption built into her bed. Yes, someone actually wrote a fictional exposé in which the Queen of France had a vibrating throne powered by tiny steam pistons. It's ridiculous, and obviously false, but it tells you how obsessed the public had become with the idea that she was somehow too sexual and not sexual enough at the same time. That contradiction? It stuck to her like perfume and powder. Meanwhile, the real Marie was deteriorating under the pressure. As her public image curdled, her private life closed up. She retreated to the Petit Trianon, a small estate on the palace grounds, where she tried to live simply, or at least play at simplicity. There she kept a small circle of trusted friends, dressed in rustic gowns, and played shepherdess in manicured gardens. To her critics, it was yet another insult. Their queen cosplaying as a milkmaid, while the kingdom fell apart. And fall apart it did. The guillotine was coming, and it didn't care about love letters or false accusations. During her trial, Marie Antoinette was subjected to horrific slander, including a claim that she had sexually abused her own son, a charge so vile, so transparently invented, that it shocked even her enemies. But the goal wasn't truth, it was humiliation. The revolution wanted to destroy her, not just as a queen, but as a woman, to shame her body as much as her crown. The scholarly debate around her sexuality continues to this day. Was she truly unfaithful? Emotionally, maybe. Physically? Unclear. Some scholars argue that her intimacy with women like Lamballe was platonic by 18th century standards, when emotional closeness between women wasn't automatically read as romantic. Others say the intensity of her letters and isolation at court made romance inevitable. As for Fersen, the case is stronger, but still lacking that one piece of indisputable evidence that would silence the arguments. But in a way, it doesn't matter. Because what defined Marie Antoinette wasn't what she did, it was what people thought she did. Her downfall was written not just in the ink of revolution, but in the filthy margins of sex-obsessed pamphlets. She became the cautionary tale of a foreign woman who dared to be visible, emotional, stylish, and occasionally defiant. And for that, they turned her into a monster. When the blade fell in 1793, it wasn't just the end of a queen, it was the end of an era. But the myths, they lived on, louder and dirtier than ever. Next, we shift gears to a different kind of royal love story, one that began with devotion and dignity, and led somehow to one of the most unexpected symbols of virility in European history, a pair of royal trousers. Let's take a breather from guillotines and gossip and drift into the prim and polished world of Victorian England. You might think we're heading into more buttoned-up territory now. After all, no one in history clutched pearls harder than the Victorians. But beneath the layers of lace, starched collars, and endless etiquette manuals, there was a quiet but intense current of passion. And at the centre of that delicate storm stood Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, arguably the most sentimental lovebirds to ever rule an empire. But make no mistake, this wasn't all piano duets and long walks in the garden. No, there were whispers, blushes, scandalous journal entries, and one infamous pair of very tight trousers. When Victoria met Albert, it wasn't love at first sight. It was more like awkward admiration between distant German cousins, arranged to marry for diplomatic stability. But something happened after their second meeting. She saw him again, this time with broader shoulders, better posture, and the kind of glimmer in his eye that made her diary pages curl. And in a shocking break from tradition, she proposed to him. That's right, the Queen of England popped the question. Victoria didn't wait around for courtly protocols or romantic gestures. She saw what she wanted and moved on it. And what she wanted was Albert. Now, their early marriage is often portrayed as squeaky clean, pure, moral, almost nauseatingly wholesome. But if you crack open Victoria's private diaries, oh boy, the woman was thirsty. She wrote about his body constantly, his eyes, his strong arms, his beautiful mouth. She once wrote that Albert's physique was like that of a Greek god, which was probably the 19th century version of texting your friends in all caps after seeing your crush in a swimsuit. And then there were the trousers. Here's where our quirky fact of the evening arrives with a well-fitted flair. Prince Albert was known, quietly but consistently, for his fashionably snug pants. His tailor crafted them to accentuate a particular royal asset, and they became something of an inside joke at court, one that leaked into wider society. Rumours swirled that Albert was so well endowed he required special tailoring to keep things contained. This gave rise to one of the strangest, most persistent myths in royal fashion history, the Prince Albert piercing. Yes, that Prince Albert. According to fringe lore, which remains completely unverified, Albert supposedly had a piercing in a very intimate location to help control the way his anatomy sat in his trousers. Was this true? Highly unlikely. Historians largely dismiss it as Victorian erotica meets urban legend, but the story stuck thanks to the era's repressed obsession with what it tried so desperately to suppress. Even today, if you mention Prince Albert in certain circles, you're not going to get a conversation about European trade reform. Back to the bedroom though, Victoria and Albert had 9 children. 9. So whatever was going on behind those royal curtains, it was frequent. She once joked in a letter that her husband had quite worn her out with his affections. Their marriage wasn't just political, it was genuinely intimate, and yet the rest of the empire was being told to behave with saint-like chastity. The queen who ruled over a nation of prudes was, in private, overwhelmed with romantic yearning. The double standard was as Victorian as afternoon tea, but this love story wasn't without its shadows. Albert, while brilliant and devoted, could be controlling. He oversaw everything from Victoria's public image to her personal letters, and their dynamic often leaned patriarchal even though she was literally the monarch. He steered her toward political caution, managed the household with Germanic precision, and worried endlessly about maintaining moral superiority in a world full of revolutions and rising middle-class opinions. He was the architect of royal respectability, and in doing so created a persona that the monarchy still clings to today. And then, abruptly, he was gone. Albert died of typhoid fever in 1861, leaving Victoria devastated beyond reason. She plunged into mourning, wore black for the rest of her life, and retreated from public duties. Her grief was vast and theatrical, but also deeply sincere. She commissioned statues, kept his rooms untouched, and even had his shaving water laid out every morning for decades. It was more than love. It was obsession, mummified in memory. This extreme mourning created its own public backlash. Some subjects admired her loyalty. Others grew impatient. Her withdrawal from public life sparked rumours. Was she still grieving, or hiding something? One particularly persistent scandal involved her close friendship with a Scottish servant named John Brown. He was rough around the edges, plain-spoken, and entirely unfit for royal company. Yet Victoria relied on him for emotional support, conversation, and perhaps more. Court insiders referred to her as Mrs. Brown behind her back, and the gossip became so rampant that it inspired both stage plays and a full-blown film a century later. Did she take another lover? Was this woman, draped in widow's black, quietly indulging in a second act of passion? Historians remain divided. Some believe the relationship was platonic. Others point to letters and diary entries that hint at something more. Victoria never publicly addressed the rumours, but she didn't do much to squash them either. And isn't that interesting? Even more eyebrow-raising was her later attachment to Abdul Karim, a young Indian servant who became her munshi, or teacher. Their bond enraged the royal household. She promoted him, showered him with gifts, and wrote him constant letters, some of which were burned after her death in a frenzied attempt to erase the connection. Was there romance? Again, unclear. But the scandal wasn't just about sex. It was about class, race, and a queen who dared, repeatedly, to ignore the rules. So here's the debate. Was Victoria a queen bound by love, or a woman defined by groove and scandal cloaked in propriety? Some see her as the model of monogamous virtue. Others see a woman who, despite rigid expectations, sought connection wherever she could find it. What's clear is this. Her reign was long, her heart intense, and her legacy tangled in desire and duty. And those trousers, still legendary. Next up, we're sticking with the British crown, but moving into a darker, more salacious territory, where scandal meets invention and a royal heir's Parisian nights get downright acrobatic. Prepare yourself for sex furniture, royal excess, and the most scandalous bachelor Europe has ever seen. Now we descend into the smoky haze of late 19th century Paris, a city humming with gas lamps, absinthe, and whispered sins. And moving discreetly or not so discreetly through its opulent brothels and lavish salons is none other than Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, future King Edward VII. Son of Queen Victoria, he was everything his mother feared. Indulgent, flashy, and absolutely not interested in practicing restraint. Where Victoria mourned for decades, Edward partied for them. If monarchy were a moral play, he was the scandalous comic relief sneaking into the wings with a cigar and a courtesan on each arm. Known fondly or sometimes mockingly as Bertie, the prince was basically the royal equivalent of a walking bachelor party. From a young age, he was caught in the contradiction of Victorian values, raised under the boot heel of moral rigidity, yet surrounded by a world desperately craving pleasure. He embraced the latter with gusto. His first public sexual scandal happened at just 19, when his military buddies arranged a liaison with an actress named Nellie Clifton. When his parents found out, Queen Victoria blamed Bertie for killing her beloved Albert, who died not long after. Grief? Illness? Sure, but she chose to funnel all her pain into blaming her son's libido. No pressure. Still, Bertie carried on. Throughout his adult life, he cultivated a personal brand that combined charm, gossip, and absolute indulgence. He became a fixture in Paris, especially at the infamous Le Chabanais, an elite brothel that catered to royalty, aristocrats, and industrial tycoons. But Bertie wasn't there for your average roll in the hay. No, he brought equipment. Which brings us to our fringe artifact of the evening, the legendary love chair. A piece of custom furniture allegedly designed for Bertie by Le Chabanais itself, it wasn't exactly subtle. This contraption allowed the prince to engage in sexual activity with 2 women at once, without putting too much strain on his royal spine. Think of it as an antique, velvet-upholstered threesome throne, complete with stirrups, headrests, and very questionable ergonomics. Was it built for pleasure or royal laziness? Possibly both. The chair still exists, by the way. You can Google it, but maybe don't if you're listening with the lights off. Back to Bertie. His Parisian escapades weren't just tolerated, they were embraced by the social elite. Courtesans competed for his attention. Hostesses rearranged dinners so he'd sit next to the most flirtatious guest. And wherever he went, scandal followed like a well-dressed shadow. He gained weight, lost discretion, and somehow made it all look stylish. With his monocle, top hat, and magnificent moustache, he swaggered through life like the lead in an R-rated operetta. Of course, he did eventually marry Princess Alexandra of Denmark, a dignified woman who endured her husband's serial affairs with the patience of a saint and the resignation of someone who knew she'd married a walking tabloid. She maintained public grace, while he maintained a rotating cast of mistresses. Some of the more famous ones include Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily, a stunning actress and socialite who managed to bed not just Bertie but half of the London elite. Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, whose affair with Bertie was so infamous it inspired satirical songs and awkward dinner parties. Alice Keppel, perhaps his final great love, who remained close to him until his death and whose great-granddaughter would one day become Camilla, Queen Consort. Yes, that Camilla. History doesn't just repeat itself, sometimes it hooks up with itself across generations. But Bertie's affairs weren't just about Lear lust. They were political. His socialising built alliances. His charm won over foreign dignitaries. He hosted dinner parties with German princes, French courtesans and British lords, smoothing over decades of tension with wine, wit, and just enough scandal to make it memorable. He understood that power doesn't always come from a throne. It can come from a whisper in a darkened ballroom or a smile across the opera box. Of course, not everyone was charmed. Queen Victoria was perpetually disappointed in him. The press often wavered between admiration and disgust. His scandals occasionally landed him in trouble, like when he was called to testify in the Tranby-Croft Baccarat scandal, a high-stakes gambling case involving cheating, lawsuits and aristocratic tantrums. Bertie wasn't accused of anything illegal, but the fact that the heir to the throne was gambling in smoky parlours with suspicious characters didn't exactly scream future king material. And yet, when Victoria finally died in 1901 and Bertie ascended as Edward VII, he surprised everyone. The man who had spent 60 years partying stepped into the crown with surprising elegance. He rebranded the monarchy with continental flair, initiated key diplomatic visits, and played a quiet but critical role in laying the groundwork for World War I alliances. Who knew the guy in the love chair had statecraft in him? So here's the scholarly debate. Was Bertie just a libertine with a title, or did his hedonism actually serve a purpose? Some argue that his indulgence disrespected the crown and distracted from governance. Others see his lifestyle as a form of soft diplomacy, uniting elites across Europe with charm and champagne. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere between the cigars and the scandal. In any case, Bertie reigned for only 9 years but left a lasting legacy. He turned monarchy from moral institution into something more human, more flawed, more modern. He didn't pretend to be perfect, he was too busy seducing actresses and adjusting his chair settings. And when he died in 1910, the nation mourned. Not just for a king, but for a man who embodied pleasure without apology. So next time you think of Edwardian England as stiff and prudish, remember the love chair. Remember the velvet. Remember Bertie, the rogue prince who proved that even royals sometimes prefer their politics with a side of kink. Now we turn to the shadows of Eastern Europe, to a man whose appetites were darker, deeper, and possibly blood-soaked. His name echoes through horror stories, but the real history of Vlad the Impaler is far stranger and far more perverse than any vampire myth. You descend now into the dark forests of 15th century Wallachia, where the trees lean in close and the night carries a metallic scent. Something primitive stirs here, just beneath the soil. You're in the land of Vlad the, also known as Vlad Chepes, Vlad the Impaler, and you can already feel the weight of the myth pressing on your chest like a heavy velvet curtain soaked in blood. But tonight you're not chasing Dracula through creaking castles and swirling fog. You're following a different trail, one soaked in lust, torture, and the twisted intersection of royal desire and calculated terror. Brace yourself, things are about to get weird. Now, Vlad's reputation is legendary and for good reason. He earned his Impaler nickname by perfecting a particularly gruesome execution method, impaling his enemies on giant stakes and leaving their bodies to rot in neat, horrifying rows. Charming. But if you zoom in closer into the bedrooms and secret chambers behind the battlefields, you find another side of Vlad. One that doesn't get mentioned in vampire movies or black metal lyrics. A side tangled in obsession, sexual dominance and control so absolute it would make even Caligula flinch. Let's start with his upbringing. Vlad was born into a world already dripping with violence. As a child, he was held hostage by the Ottoman Empire, alongside his younger brother Radu. They were essentially political pawns, kept alive, but constantly reminded of their expendability. During his time in Ottoman custody, Vlad would have been exposed to all kinds of courtly dynamics, diplomacy, cruelty, and yes, some rather unorthodox expressions of affection. There's a long-standing theory that he may have experienced or witnessed sexual abuse in captivity, especially since it was common practice among some Ottoman nobles to use young hostages in ways that no medieval etiquette manual would dare spell out. When Vlad returned to Wallachia and seized power, he brought with him not just military tactics, but methods. Methods for breaking people, for humiliating them, for bending them to his will. And many of those methods had an uncomfortable tinge of sexual domination. You see, for Vlad, punishment wasn't just about death. It was about degradation. His enemies were often stripped naked before execution. Some were forced into degrading poses. Others were impaled through particular, sensitive entry points. This wasn't just killing, it was performance. Eroticized violence disguised as justice. There's even a recorded instance of Vlad inviting foreign envoys to his court, only to punish them for refusing to remove their hats, by having the hats nailed to their heads. Not sexual per se, but it shows the same obsession with physical domination, submission, and body control. Vlad didn't just want obedience, he wanted violation. He wanted to unmake you, piece by piece, until you were just another example of his power. Now let's talk about the women in his life, because oh yes, there were women, and the relationships ranged from passionate to profoundly disturbing. Vlad's first wife remained something of a mystery, but she met a tragic end, throwing herself from the walls of Poneri Castle during a siege. According to folklore, she cried out that she'd rather die than be captured by the Turks or face her husband's wrath. What does that say about their marriage? Well, let's just say it wasn't candlelit dinners and matching goblets. Later, Vlad married a second time, reportedly to a cousin of Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. This alliance was political, of course, and while there are fewer legends about her demise, it's safe to assume she lived under the same reign of absolute control. Vlad wasn't the sort of man to share power or trust. His obsession with betrayal bordered on pathological. That extended to lovers, to servants, to everyone. Love for Vlad may have always been tangled with suspicion. Here's your fringe fact. There's a fringe theory, admittedly more folklore than academic, that Vlad would sometimes sleep with the corpses of his victims. Yep, you heard that right. Necrophilia. The idea being that his lust for domination extended even past death, making the body nothing more than an object. A trophy. Is there hard evidence for this? No. But the fact that such stories exist and persist tells you a lot about how people viewed him, not just as a killer, but as a twisted, erotic force, a ruler whose lust wasn't for bodies in bed, but bodies broken. Historians argue bitterly over this. Some say these stories are pure propaganda, spread by enemies like the Saxons, who hated Vlad and had every reason to paint him as a demon. Others believe there's a kernel of truth, maybe not corpse-loving, but certainly pleasure taken in suffering. It's also worth noting that some of the most lurid accounts of Vlad's cruelty were written after his death, often in countries he never ruled. That doesn't mean they're false, but it does mean they were useful. And here's the twist. Vlad didn't hide this side of himself, he broadcasted it. He wanted people to be afraid. His version of sexual power wasn't hidden in secret chambers. It was planted outside his castles, swaying in the breeze on sharp wooden stakes. Imagine ruling a country where your enemies know that even their corpses might be subjected to your royal displeasure. That's not just tyranny, that's theatre. But did he enjoy traditional romance? It's hard to say. The few love letters that survive suggest formality, not passion. His political alliances were brittle. His court was constantly shifting. The only consistent partner he ever had was fear. And while we can't diagnose a 15th century warlord with modern psychology, let's just say that if Vlad walked into therapy today, the session would run long. Still, his legacy is a sticky, not just because Bram Stoker borrowed his name for Dracula, but because there's something disturbingly seductive about Vlad. He represents a kind of unchecked male power, where violence and sex aren't separate, they're fused, and whether or not he acted out every rumour he let the world believe he did. That belief, more than any act, made him immortal. So next time you hear Dracula, don't picture the cape and fangs. Picture the real Vlad, blood on his boots, cold eyes fixed on the horizon, and 100 enemies impaled behind him, their bodies forming a grotesque crown of terror. He didn't drink cut blood, but he feasted on fear. And in his own terrible way, he probably enjoyed it. Coming up next, we're staying in the Roman Empire where the wine flows, the morals crumble, and one emperor makes Vlad look like a shy librarian. Get ready for incest, cross-dressing, and a royal horse in the Senate. Yep, Caligula is here, and he's not wearing pants. You step now into marble corridors that echo with laughter, the wrong kind of laughter. Too loud, too so sharp, the kind that makes everyone at the banquet table exchange worried glances. You're in the Roman Empire during the reign of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by the name that still makes historians wince, Caligula. And if you've heard the name before, you probably know at least 3 things. He was an emperor, he was insane, and he allegedly made his horse a senator. But what they don't tell you in school, probably for the best, is that Caligula's reign wasn't just violent or erratic. It was one long feverish orgy of power, with sex as the currency, the weapon, and the punchline. Let's start with his origin story. Caligula was the golden child of Germanicus, a beloved general, and Agrippina the Elder, a powerful noblewoman. As a toddler, he toddled around military camps wearing a miniature soldier's uniform, earning him the nickname Caligula, or Little Boots. It was cute, at first, but beneath the childhood charm was a boy raised in the shadow of murder. His father was probably poisoned. His mother was exiled and starved. His brothers? Executed. So when he eventually became emperor at age 25, after the death of Emperor Tiberius, he didn't just take the throne, he inherited a blood-soaked stage, and he walked on with his own script. At first, Caligula tried to play the role of beloved emperor. He gave bonuses to the military, he pardoned prisoners, people cheered, statues were raised, temples were dedicated, but within a year, things changed drastically. Some historians blame a serious illness, possibly epilepsy or encephalitis, that altered his mind. Others think the real Caligula was just biding his time. Either way, the mask cracked, and what emerged was a monarch who wielded sexuality like a flaming sword. And here's where things get deeply uncomfortable. Caligula turned the Roman court into a playhouse of humiliation. He would summon senators' wives to his bedroom in the middle of feasts, sleep with them, then return to the table and give graphic reviews of their performance. He didn't just want power, he wanted domination. And for Caligula, domination meant violating social boundaries, especially sexual ones. He was the emperor, therefore your wife, your sister, your body, none of it was off limits. He took multiple lovers, both men and women, but what made it truly scandalous wasn't the bisexuality. That wasn't unusual for Romans. It was the cruelty. He made his palace into a brothel, literally. He allegedly turned part of the imperial palace into a public sex house, staffed by members of the nobility. If the accounts are true, he'd have people brought in off the street to watch the aristocracy degrade themselves for his amusement. This wasn't lust. This was performance art with a body count. Now let's talk about the most infamous part of the Caligula rumour mill, his sisters. He had 3, Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla and Livilla, and if ancient gossip is to be believed, he slept with all of them. But it was Drusilla who seems to have held the deepest sway over him. He adored her, worshipped her. Some sources even claim he declared her his wife in all but name. When she died young, possibly in childbirth, he went into a tailspin. He declared her a goddess. publicly mourned her with obsessive ritual. Some fringe theories claim the child she carried was his. Scholars debate this endlessly, but the fact that the rumours persist tells you exactly how far his reputation slid off the rails. And now, your fringe fact. Caligula once dressed as Venus, the goddess of love, and had himself paraded through the streets in full makeup and a golden wig, declaring that he was both the king and queen of Rome. Gender roles, erased, imperial dignity, torched. He wanted to be everything, all at once, divine and depraved, feared and desired. His sexual identity, if we can even call it that, wasn't about orientation. It was about disorientation, keeping everyone so unsettled that no one dared challenge him. Of course, there's the infamous tale of his horse, Incitatus. You've heard it. He made the horse a senator. Or maybe just promised to. The sources are contradictory. Some claim the horse had a marble stall and a jewelled collar, and yes, an invitation to political dinners. But most scholars believe this wasn't madness. It was mockery. Caligula was trolling the Senate, basically saying, "You're all so useless, even my horse can do your job." And honestly, iconic. But don't get it twisted, his antics weren't just outrageous, they were terrifying. Caligula blurred the lines between pleasure and punishment so completely that no one knew if they were being seduced or sentenced. He once told the public he wished Rome had a single neck, so he could slice it with one sword. When he wasn't staging orgies, he was inventing new methods of execution. One report claims he had prisoners sawed in half vertically, just to see how long they'd scream. Sex and death, love and violence, they all became interchangeable props in his grand, grotesque theatre. And here's the scholarly headache. How much of this is real? Ancient sources on Caligula, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, loved a good scandal. They were writing after his death, often with political motives, eager to vilify him. Some historians argue that the most outrageous stories are exaggerations, or outright fabrications. Others point out that even if half the tales are true, it paints a portrait of a man utterly consumed by ego, pain and unchecked power. What we do know is that he didn't last long. 4 years into his reign, in 41 CE, he was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard. They stabbed him to death in a corridor, along with his wife and infant daughter. It was messy, brutal, fitting. His body was reportedly buried in a shallow grave, and his name was erased from public monuments. Rome doesn't like being embarrassed. But the legend never died. Caligula remains the cautionary tale of what happens when divine power meets unfiltered impulse. A monarch who declared himself a god and acted like the devil, and in the shadows of all that chaos was a man whose sexual tyranny turned the Roman court into a maze of terror, arousal, and degradation. Next we head to Renaissance Italy for a story so tangled it makes Caligula look organised. There, in the candlelit corridors of Vatican-adjacent palaces, you'll meet a noblewoman whose beauty was matched only by her reputation, and whose family might just take the prize for most scandalous dynasty in Europe. Yes, it's time for Lucrezia Borgia. Welcome to Italy during the Renaissance, where art blossoms, poisons simmer, and scandal is not just a side dish, it's the main course. You've landed sack in the middle of the Borgia family's epic, sweaty, rumour-ridden dynasty, and at the heart of it all is Lucrezia Borgia, the woman whose name still gets whispered like a curse or a kink, depending on who's doing the whispering. Her reputation has been scrubbed, polished, and mangled for centuries, blamed for everything from fratricide to incest to dabbling in deadly aphrodisiacs. But was she a pawn, a poisoner, or just a teenage girl trapped in one of history's messiest power games? Let's rewind the chaos a bit. Lucrezia was born in 1480, the illegitimate daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal who would go on to become Pope Alexander VI. Yes, you heard that right. The Pope had kids, several in fact. Catholic celibacy at the time was more like a polite suggestion than an actual lifestyle. Rodrigo wasn't just breaking the rules, he was throwing them into a Venetian canal with a brick tied to their feet. From the beginning, Lucrezia was a chess piece in a game no one wins. Her father and brothers, especially the charming and terrifying Cesare Borgia, used her as leverage in political alliances. By the age of 13, she was married off to a powerful nobleman, Giovanni Sforza, to secure an alliance with Milan. The marriage was cold, strategic, and famously unconsummated, something the Borgias used to get it annulled. The excuse, Giovanni was impotent, a devastating public humiliation. In retaliation, Sforza spread a rumour that would stick like a burr for centuries. that Lucrezia was not just sleeping with her father and brother, but that the Borgia palace was a literal hotbed of incestuous orgies, and this is where her reputation takes a permanent nosedive. The incest accusations have never been proven. No contemporary sources confirm them outright, but the damage was done. In the public eye, Lucrezia became the ultimate femme fatale, beautiful, blonde, seductive, and morally radioactive. Portraits show her with pale skin, soft features, and that eerie calm that always makes you think she knows exactly how you're going to die. Let's talk about the poison ring. One of the most enduring and frankly stylish legends about Lucrezia is that she wore a hollow ring designed to release poison into a rival's drink with a discreet flick of her hand. Now, was that actually a thing? Maybe. Poison was kind of the family brand. The Borgias were accused of using a brew called cantarella, a mix of arsenic and vinegar, said to cause slow and poetic death. No hard proof links Lucrezia to actual poisonings, but several enemies of the family did die in deeply suspicious ways shortly after dining with them. Coincidence? Or just a very aggressive form of hospitality? Meanwhile, her second marriage didn't fare much better. She was married to Alfonso of Aragon, a handsome young noble with good abs and terrible luck. Despite their awkward political arrangement, Lucrezia reportedly fell genuinely in love with him. She even gave birth to a son, but then her brother Cesare, growing jealous or possibly threatened, had Alfonso murdered, stabbed in the street, finished off in bed. Lucrezia was devastated, and that was the point when she started to change. After that, the girl who had once been a pawn began playing her own game. She became Duchess of Ferrara through a third marriage to Alfonso d'Este, a powerful noble who tolerated her scandal-soaked past in exchange for political benefits. But Ferrara gave Lucrezia something rare, a kingdom of her own. She flourished. She became a patron of the arts, opened a literary salon, and ran her court with steel-spined grace. If you're looking for a redemption arc, this is it. Still, the rumours never stopped. People whispered that she kept lovers in secret chambers, that her father and brother used her body to test out new poisons, that she bore a secret child, possibly fathered by Cesare, whose existence was covered up with forged documents and frantic clerical hand-waving. There's even a debate over the identity of a mysterious child named Giovanni, who appeared in papal records with shifting parental designations. Was he her son, her brother? Her nephew, cousin, son, brother's boyfriend's kid? No one really knows. Renaissance family trees were less trees and more overgrown hedges, with secrets hiding in the roots. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Some believe that Lucrezia owned an erotically illustrated copy of Ovid's Ars Amatoria, a Roman guide to love and seduction. The pages, allegedly marked with annotations and pressed flower petals, were found centuries later, dog-eared in ways that suggest this wasn't just casual reading. Whether it was hers or not is up for debate. But the idea that a Borgia woman spent her nights paging through ancient sex tips while plotting political alliances? Chef's kiss. So what do historians actually believe about Lucrezia? It's complicated. Some argue she was a victim controlled by her father and brother, forced into marriages, blamed for their crimes. Others say she was complicit, fully aware of the deals being made with her body. Some even paint her as a clever manipulator who used her circumstances to carve out real power. The truth is, she might have been all of those things at once: woman, wife, widow, patron, suspect, survivor. By the time she died in 1519, Lucrezia had transformed from scandalous pawn to respected duchess. She was mourned not just as a noblewoman, but as a legitimate force in her own right. And yet, the legend stuck harder than the facts, because nothing excites the historical imagination like a woman who's both saint and seductress, accused of sins so wild they'd make Caligula blush. So the next time someone brings up the Borgias with a smirk, remember this. Lucrezia's story wasn't just about lust, it was about control, about the terrifying intimacy between sex, power and survival. And in a world where women were supposed to stay quiet, she left behind echoes that are still whispering centuries later. Coming up next, we're heading back to England to meet a king whose love life was so destructive it created an entire new church. Get ready for annulments, obsessions, and more dead wives than your average horror movie. Yes, it's Henry VIII time. It's morning in Tudor England, and the bells are tolling again. Another royal wedding, another royal funeral, sometimes just days apart. Welcome to the reign of Henry VIII, a man who treated marriage like a weapons-grade hobby. He wasn't just a king, he was a walking romantic catastrophe. 6 wives, countless mistresses, mountains of annulment paperwork, and at least 2 royal executions. Henry wasn't just ruled by lust, he weaponized it. And somehow, in the middle of all the bed-hopping and beheadings, he managed to found the Church of England. You know, as one does when the Pope won't grant your divorce, and you're determined to get what you want in bed and in heaven. Let's rewind. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was 17, tall, athletic, charismatic, and shockingly attractive by Renaissance standards. Think broad shoulders, long legs, and a flair for jousting that screamed heart-throb with a sword, and he was married. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, was his dead brother's widow. Yep, we're already off to a weird start, and the marriage was initially fine, respectful, even warm, but Catherine couldn't give him what he wanted most, a male heir. Over time, their relationship withered. Catherine aged, Henry wandered. Enter Anne Boleyn, the woman who set England on fire with nothing but her wit, ambition, and really excellent sleeves. Unlike Henry's previous flings, Anne said no. She refused to be his mistress. She wanted a crown. So Henry began the slow, sulky process of trying to divorce Catherine, a process that took 7 years. That's longer than most modern marriages. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry basically said, "Fine, I'll be my own Pope," and invented the Church of England, just like that. One man's romantic obsession ended centuries of religious tradition. This wasn't just a breakup, it was a theological earthquake, all because Henry really wanted to sleep with Anne legally. They finally married in 1533, and Anne became queen. Victory, right? Not for long. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become a legendary queen in her own right. But no sons. Tensions rose. Henry's eye began to wander again. And then, in a spectacular fall from grace, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Most historians believe the accusations were false, cooked up by Henry's allies to get her out of the way. Regardless, she was executed in 1536, beheaded with a French sword for a cleaner cut. How considerate. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, was the one who finally gave him a male heir, Edward VI, but died shortly after childbirth. He actually seemed to love Jane, or at least mourn her properly. Still, that didn't stop him from marrying again, and again, and again. Fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Henry chose her based on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein and was furious when she showed up looking slightly less filtered than expected. He called her a Flanders mare and had the marriage annulled within 6 months. But to her credit, Anne played the game perfectly. She agreed to the annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and lived out her life comfortably as the king's beloved sister. She even stayed on good terms with him. Honestly, Anne of Cleves won the whole saga by not dying or getting arrested. Then came wife number 5, Catherine Howard, who was 19 to Henry's 49. The marriage was a disaster from day one. Catherine, young and surrounded by opportunists, got caught up in a series of affairs, some possibly before the marriage, some during, and when Henry found out, his heartbreak turned to rage. She was executed for adultery, though whether it was love, naivety, or sheer recklessness that doomed her is still debated. All that's certain is she died young and terrified, whispering, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," referring to one of her lovers. Yikes. By the time he married his 6th and final wife, Catherine Permoya, Henry was tired, bloated, and barely mobile. But Catherine was smart, very smart. She navigated court politics like a ninja in a corset. She nursed him, entertained his children, and kept her head literally in, by knowing when to agree and when to disappear for a few days until his mood passed. Catherine outlived Henry, eventually marrying for love after his death. A rare happy ending in a sea of royal wreckage. Now, let's pause for the fringe fact. There's a theory that Henry's declining libido and increasing paranoia were due to chronic health problems, including a massive leg ulcer that oozed constantly and may have caused septic blood poisoning. Sexy, right? Some even speculate syphilis, although no definitive evidence confirms that. Either way, Henry's body failed long before his ego did, and his obsession with virility, airs, and control morphed into something cruel and desperate. He wanted to be loved, feared, and obeyed, and when that triangle fell out of balance, someone usually lost their head. So what's the scholarly verdict on Henry VIII's lust life? Was he a hopeless romantic turned tyrant? A sex addict disguised as a statesman? Or just a man born into too much power, taught from birth that his pleasure was divine right? Some historians argue he was deeply insecure, haunted by masculinity, terrified of failure. Others paint him as a sociopathic narcissist who used love as leverage, but in either case his relationships weren't just emotional, they were political weapons, and the consequences catastrophic. His quest for a male heir triggered a religious schism, hundreds of executions, and a brutal reshaping of English society, all because one man couldn't tolerate rejection or a uterus that didn't produce sons fast enough. Still, Henry left a legacy as twisted and tangled as his love life. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would go on to rule England in their own radically different ways. His Church of England would evolve, fracture, and reshape Western Christianity, and his 6 wives, each a cautionary tale in her own right, remain immortalised in rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Coming up next, we dig deeper into a royal bloodline that took lust to a whole new level: the Habsburgs of Spain, a dynasty where incest wasn't a scandal, it was policy. Step carefully now. You're entering the royal gene pool of the Spanish Habsburgs, and let's just say the water is murky. This isn't your average scandalous family tree. This is a vine twisted so tightly around itself it's practically strangling the crown. Welcome to a dynasty where incest wasn't whispered about. It was scheduled, strategized, repeated, over and over. In their obsessive pursuit of keeping blood pure and titles neatly folded within the family, the Habsburgs turned sex into a genetic horror show. And by the end of it, they weren't just marrying their cousins, they were marrying their nieces, their uncles, and sometimes what looked suspiciously like their own chromosomes wearing a crown. Let's take it from the top. The Habsburgs were one of Europe's most powerful ruling families, controlling vast swathes of territory from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire. Their strategy for maintaining power? Keep it in the family, literally. Instead of marrying outside their noble circle, they married within it, again and again, until the family tree was more of a wreath. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and somehow they thought this was working. At first it seemed like it was. The dynasty thrived, their empires expanded. But behind the gilded doors in shadowy royal bedchambers, something began to go wrong. Children were born with alarming health issues, fertility rates dropped, mental and physical deformities became more common. Still, the solution wasn't, hey, maybe we should mix in some fresh tea. It was, let's double down. Enter our main character tonight, Charles II of Spain, the tragic full stop at the end of this genetic sentence. Born in 1661, Charles was the product of multiple generations of inbreeding. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece, yes, niece, and Charles was what you get when a royal gene pool becomes a royal puddle. From the beginning, Charles was frail, sickly, and shockingly underdeveloped. He didn't speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His tongue was so large he had trouble eating and drooled constantly. A condition that made court painters awkwardly fudge his portraits, but nothing could hide the Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite so extreme it made chewing nearly impossible, and speaking sound like a half-muffled moan. His face became a symbol of royal inbreeding, immortalised in oil and canvas. Now, you're probably wondering, how does this connect to sex scandals? Well, let's talk about his marriages. Yes, plural. In a last-ditch attempt to save the dynasty, Charles was married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess known for her beauty and charm. But despite their best efforts, and by best efforts, we mean a mountain of aphrodisiacs, prayers, and diplomatic pressure, they produced no children. Marie-Louise reportedly found Charles's condition so distressing that she once told her attendants she'd rather be a nun than spend another night married to death itself. She died at 26, possibly from stress, possibly from poison, because even in this decaying monarchy, murder was still a solid plan B. Then came wife number 2, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen specifically for her proven fertility. She came from a family of many, many siblings. Once again, the pressure was enormous. Maria Anna tried her best, but Charles was physically incapable of fathering children. Rumours swirled that he was impotent or even sexually malformed, with one courtier claiming his genitals were as shriveled as his wit. Brutal. Fringe fact time, there's an actual document, written by a royal physician, that lists Charles's reproductive health in disturbingly specific terms. It notes his cold temperament, melancholic nature, and lack of seed. This wasn't medical language. It was a desperate dynastic autopsy. Spain needed an heir. And that their king was effectively a human warning label. This is what happens when you marry your cousin's cousin's cousin too many times. Charles himself became an object of pity, fear, and superstition. Some believed he was cursed, others thought he was possessed. The Spanish Inquisition was even called in to perform exorcisms on him. Yes, actual royal exorcisms, as if the problem was demonic and not just centuries of lazy matchmaking. Clergy would chant and sprinkle holy water, while behind closed doors, advisors scrambled to figure out how to keep the empire from crumbling. And crumble it did. With no heir and a body collapsing under the weight of its own DNA, Charles died in 1700 at just 38. His autopsy, which may or may not be exaggerated, claimed his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His intestines were rotted, and his body did not contain a single drop of blood. A medical nightmare or a piece of royal horror fiction? Either way, it marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. Now, scholars debate just how exaggerated the legends around Charles II really are. Some think later historians piled on to make the story more grotesque. Others believe the reports are accurate, supported by both medical observations and the very real effects of severe inbreeding. What's not in question is this. Charles was the tragic product of a dynasty that confused power with isolation. A man born into silk sheets and golden cribs, whose royal destiny was to fail in bed, in politics, and ultimately in blood. So yes, this was a sex scandal. But not because anyone was sneaking around. Because everyone was sleeping with the wrong people, openly, generationally, with state approval. It was one of history's most methodical sexual disasters, ending with a king too broken to reproduce, and an empire too fractured to survive. And what came after Charles? A war. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought over who got to clean up the mess. Spoiler, it took decades and a reshuffling of half the continent. All because no one in the family thought to marry a stranger with decent genetics and ideally a jaw that worked. Next, we head east, beyond Europe, behind a curtain of etiquette and empire, to a world where emperors were cloaked in mystery, and love came in the form of ritual, poetry, and a hierarchy of silken screens. Prepare yourself for the hidden sensuality of Japan's imperial court. The lanterns flicker softly in the imperial gardens. The wind carries the scent of cedar and old ink. You are now deep within the chrysanthemum curtain, the symbolic divide between the public face and private flesh of Japan's imperial family. Unlike the loud, bloody dramas of Europe's monarchies, the love lives of Japan's royals operated in hushed tones and well-oiled doors. But don't mistake serenity for purity. Behind the layers of silk and ceremony, there existed a hidden world of sensuality, formalized, coded, and deeply poetic. Welcome to a court where sex was scripted, scheduled and sometimes choreographed in verse. Let's set the stage. During the Heian period, 794 to 185, the imperial court of Japan reached its aesthetic and erotic peak. This was the era of the Tale of Genji, widely considered the world's first novel, and arguably the world's first softcore fan fiction starring a fictional prince whose entire purpose was seducing every eligible woman, and occasionally some not-so-eligible ones, in the palace. Genji's fictional adventures weren't outlandish fantasies, they were reflections of real court life. In this world, sex and status were so intertwined, they could barely be separated. Rank determined everything. When you could visit a lover, what colour kimono you wore, how many paper walls separated you from the emperor. Night visits, or yobai, were an art form. A high-ranking man would send a poem ahead of him, usually written in elegant calligraphy on scented paper, announcing his intent to visit. If the woman accepted, he could arrive under cover of night and, with the assistance of attentive servants, be ushered silently into her room. The next morning, another poem. Always. Even if the night was awkward, or if he tripped over a floor mat, or if the whole thing lasted 60 seconds. The emotional contract was sealed in poetic regret or praise. These weren't casual hookups. These were performances, written in ink and sealed with pressed flowers. Let's talk about the emperor himself, who was expected to maintain a carefully curated web of lovers, not for pleasure necessarily, but for political balance. The primary wife, or chugu, held status similar to a queen consort. But there were also Nyogo, Koi and Naishi-no-kami tiers of imperial consorts, each ranked, each from noble families, and each a potential mother to future emperors. These women weren't just love interests, they were dynastic chess pieces, sent into the court with scrolls, hairpins, and quiet ambition. Now here's your fringe fact. In some eras, retired emperors, having abdicated in favour of their sons, were known to establish cloistered courts, where they basically ran shadow governments and indulged in romantic freedom. Some became monks publicly while maintaining lovers privately. Imagine stepping down from the throne, putting on robes, and still sliding love poems under a screen door while dictating state policy. That's multitasking. But not all was graceful. The imperial court, despite its Polish, was still a web of rivalry. Women who failed to capture the emperor's attention could be dismissed, exiled, or worse, simply ignored into invisibility. Conversely, a favoured lover could gain enormous power, with her family rising through court ranks like bamboo in spring. And yes, scandals happened. Jealousy poisoned more than one well. There are whispered accounts of women slipping powders into the cosmetics of rivals, or using subtle perfumes designed to trigger migraines. And the men? Not always discreet. While official records are polite, the diaries of court ladies tell a more complex story of passion, boredom, and the subtle humiliations of being a pawn in a very elegant game. Then came the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, when the emperor's role became more symbolic and political power shifted to the shogunate. The imperial court's sensual rituals didn't disappear. They simply grew more private, tucked behind a fortress of etiquette. Emperors still had consorts, still had concubines, but now their affairs were less about statecraft and more about ritualized tradition. Sex became a sacred duty, something you did to ensure the continuity of the imperial bloodline, not because you felt like getting frisky on a Tuesday night. But that didn't mean it was devoid of emotion. The Japanese court has always had a deep cultural connection to ephemeral love, that bittersweet, fleeting romance found in moonlight and cherry blossoms. Affairs were celebrated not in bawdy tavern songs, but in waka poems, each line capturing a heartbeat, a moment, a whisper against a lacquered screen. It was sensuality without sweat, passion wrapped in layers of silk, where the undressing was often more intimate than the act itself. And yet, with all this refinement, the imperial household was not immune to control and censorship. Even in modern times, the personal lives of Japan's royals remain shrouded in secrecy. Love matches are rare. Emperors have historically married within the nobility, and women who marry out of the family often lose their royal status. The rules are old, rigid, and deeply embedded in the idea that the emperor is not just a man, but a descendant of the gods. That kind of pressure doesn't exactly leave room for romantic experimentation. Scholars debate just how sexually active the emperors really were, especially as Japan modernized. Some argue the court grew increasingly celibate, retreating into symbolic tradition while real power moved elsewhere. Others suggest that behind closed doors, human longing continued like it always had, quietly, formally, and layered in metaphor. Because that's the thing about the Japanese imperial court. Its sex scandals are rarely loud. There are no wild beheadings, no throne-top orgies, no exiled mistresses writing tell-all books. Instead, the scandal lies in what's unsaid, in the poem with a smudge, the silence between letters, the consort who suddenly disappears from records. You don't find the drama by kicking down doors. You find it by unfolding a dusty scroll and realizing that someone was in love, and never allowed to say so. So yes, the imperial court was sensual, but it was also a prison, beautifully decorated and eternally watched. Desire didn't roar, it sighed. And sometimes, that sigh echoed for centuries. Coming up next, we step into a different kind of royal pleasure palace, one with hundreds of women, secret passageways, eunuch guards, and political power draped in silks. That's right, we're entering the harem of the Ottoman sultans, where every lover could be a queen or a ghost by sunrise. It's night in Constantinople, the moonlight glows off the Bosphorus like liquid silver, and the sound of water lapping against stone is nearly drowned by the hush of silken slippers and whispered gossip behind heavy lattice screens. You're now inside the Topkapi Palace, seat of the Ottoman Empire, and home to one of history's most misunderstood and most meticulously engineered institutions of sensuality and power, the imperial harem. This wasn't just some hedonistic playground for bored sultans. This was a highly organised, politically charged ecosystem where sex, motherhood and survival collided in spectacularly dramatic fashion. First, let's debunk the obvious. The word harem might conjure up mental images of belly dancers, reclining couches and oil-slicked fantasy. But the reality, a lot more structured. The harem was a political institution, guarded by eunuchs, managed by senior concubines, and arranged in strict hierarchy. Women weren't lounging around waiting to be chosen. They were being trained in etiquette, language, music, conversation, court politics, and yes, how to please the Sultan, though probably not in the ways the pulp novels would have you believe. At the top of this pyramid sat the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was untouchable, powerful, and often the most influential figure in the empire, capable of appointing officials, brokering alliances, and occasionally arranging poisonings. Below her were the Haseki Sultan, chief consort, the Khadans, official wives or senior concubines, and below them the Iqbals and Guzdas, whose titles literally translated to favourites and those who caught the eye. And below them were hundreds of young girls, often slaves brought from all corners of the empire, many of whom would never see the Sultan's face, let alone his bed. So how did you go from low-ranking nobody to the Sultan's lover? Well, first you needed to survive years of training and court discipline. You had to learn to read poetry, keep secrets, and carry yourself like someone who might give birth to the next ruler. You were not encouraged to fall in love. That was dangerous. Your job wasn't to seduce, it was to be ready, composed and perfectly poised in case fate called you up from the sidelines. And then, if and when the Sultan did choose you, your life could change in a single night. You might be granted your own quarters, jewellery, servants, influence, or you might be sent back into the ranks the next day, never to be called again. And if you became pregnant, especially with a son, your political stock skyrocketed. Sons meant succession, and succession meant war. That's where things got real. Fringe fact time, the Ottoman Empire had a period known as the Sultanate of Women, roughly 1533 to 1656, during which imperial consorts and mothers wielded enormous power, sometimes more than the sultans themselves. This era saw women like Hurrem Sultan, the legendary consort of Suleiman the Magnificent, rise from Ukraine. Ukrainian slave to queen in all but title. Hurrem didn't just sleep with the Sultan, she shaped his policies, advised him in statecraft, and wrote diplomatic letters to other rulers. When she gave birth to multiple children, including a future sultan, she shattered tradition by marrying Suleiman, making her the first imperial consort to be formally wed in over 2 centuries. The court was scandalized, the empire was transformed, and then there was Kösem Sultan, a later Valide who practically ran the Ottoman Empire through her sons and grandson, orchestrating assassinations and playing imperial factions against one another, while maintaining an image of maternal grace. These women weren't just beautiful, they were terrifyingly competent. They understood that in the harem, the womb was a throne, and sex was just the opening move in a lifelong game of survival. But it wasn't all power and perfumes. The harem could be vicious. Jealousy ran hot. Rivalries among consorts were constant, and whisper campaigns could end lives. Women were accused of witchcraft, adultery, or poisoning, often with flimsy evidence but devastating consequences. Some were exiled to the old palace, where discarded concubines spent their remaining years like forgotten chess pieces. Others, more tragically, were quietly strangled with silk cords, an Ottoman execution method reserved for nobility, because even in death, dignity had to be preserved. Now, let's talk about the sultans. Not all were playboys. Some rarely visited the harem. Others, like Murad IV, used it as an emotional retreat while violently purging the empire of corruption. A few had hundreds of concubines, but favoured only one. Some were rumoured to have same-sex relationships despite the sea of women available to them. And at least one, Ibrahim V, famously became obsessed with a single concubine, Shivakar Sultan, said to be voluptuous beyond measure. So obsessed was he with her body type that he reportedly sent his men across the empire searching for women with similarly excessive proportions. You might call it a preference. Historians called it madness. Speaking of madness, Ibrahim's reign ended when he was deposed and strangled by his own executioners, ordered by his mother. The harem gives and the harem takes away. Scholars still debate whether the harem was a gilded cage or a ladder of opportunity. Some argue it was exploitative by nature, populated by women taken from their homes, forced into a system that viewed them as vessels. Others point out that for many women, especially those born into poverty or war, the harem offered security, education, and the potential for real agency in a brutal world. Maybe it was both, a prison with a throne at the end of the hallway. And let's not forget the eunuchs, castrated men who ran the harem with absolute authority. Chief among them was the Kızlar, the chief black eunuch, who acted as both gatekeeper and political broker. He knew who entered, who left, who was in favour, and who needed to disappear. In a court obsessed with secrets, eunuchs were the ultimate vaults. So was the Ottoman harem a den of debauchery, or a finely tuned engine of imperial continuity? Probably both. It was a space where the politics of sex were rendered ceremonial, calculated, and sometimes fatal, where intimacy was regulated, weaponized, and tied directly to national stability, where women without surnames could become queens, and a single night's pleasure could start or end an empire. Next, we're leaving the smoky opulence of the East and heading to the storybook hills of Bavaria. There, in a castle that looks like it was designed by a sugar-addled architect with a flair for drama, lived a king so consumed by fantasy and forbidden longing that he built entire kingdoms in his imagination, and invited no one to live in them. Yes, it's time to meet King Ludwig II, the Swan King, and the man who possibly loved no one but his own reflection. Mist hangs low over the Bavarian Alps, curling around the turrets of a castle so ornate, so dreamy, it could have been sketched during a fever dream by a Gothic Disney architect with a Wagner obsession. Welcome to Neuschwanstein, the crown jewel of architectural escapism built by a king who refused to live in reality. Inside its halls, plush, vaulted, lonely, you'll find the strange haunting story of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, also known as the Swan King, or less flatteringly, Mad King Ludwig. But if you peel back the embroidered curtains, the frescoed fantasies, and the extravagant solitude, what you'll uncover is a ruler tormented by desire, for beauty, for male companionship, and for a world where he never had to explain either. Born in 1845, Ludwig was never destined to be average. He was artistic, withdrawn, and obsessed with myth from the start. As a child, he devoured German folklore, plays, and epic poems, idolising medieval knights, gods, and tragic heroes. While most royal boys were learning fencing or statecraft, Ludwig was memorising arias and sketching dragons. His court tutors described him as dreamy, which is polite German for "this kid isn't going to fit in." He became king at 18. Almost immediately, Ludwig made it clear he had zero interest in traditional rule. Parliament bored him. Budgets gave him migraines. He'd attend one government meeting, then vanish into the mountains for days, hunting swans and quoting Richard Wagner librettos. Wagner, in fact, became the centre of Ludwig's early adult life, not just his music, but the man himself. Ludwig idolised Wagner, sponsored his operas, and wrote him letters that sound a lot less like royal correspondence and a lot more like emotionally fraught fan mail. Wagner, a debt-ridden composer with a massive ego, milked it. Hard. And here's where things get quietly scandalous. Though Ludwig was officially engaged once to Duchess Sophie, his cousin, he broke off the engagement before it reached the aisle. His letters to her were stiff and distant. His diaries, meanwhile, overflow with anxiety about marriage and intimacy. His letters to male friends, on the other hand, intensely affectionate, especially one man, Richard Hornig, Ludwig's private secretary. Their correspondence is loaded with longing and coded devotion, the kind of thing that makes historians pause and wonder, is this poetry or a cry for a cuddle? Fringe fact incoming. Ludwig had a private grotto installed in one of his castles, an indoor cave, complete with mood lighting, a waterfall and a swan boat. He'd sit in it alone at night, listening to music, dressed like Lohengrin, the Swan Knight, a mythical hero who arrives in a boat pulled by a swan, saves the girl, and then leaves before morning. The metaphor writes itself. There's little doubt Ludwig was homosexual, or at the very least deeply romantically drawn to men. But this was 19th century Bavaria, where such desires weren't just taboo, they were criminal. Ludwig lived under constant pressure to marry, to reproduce, to act like a king. Instead, he built castles, 3 to be exact, each more absurdly romantic than the last. He poured millions into their design, turrets, frescoes, gold leaf, artificial caves, and murals of half-naked knights in battle with dragons, always with an undercurrent of yearning and escape. Scholars debate whether his building frenzy was a coping mechanism for repressed sexuality, a psychological break, or just a very expensive midlife crisis. Some say Ludwig was a visionary artist trapped in a world of bureaucrats. Others believe he was emotionally unstable, possibly manic-depressive, with sexual guilt bleeding into grandiosity. Either way, the connection between his lust and his loneliness is undeniable. He created fantasy worlds because the real one wouldn't let him love the way he wanted. Eventually, his behaviour became impossible to ignore. He stopped appearing in public. His spending skyrocketed. He took to eating alone in a hall filled with mirrors, having his food delivered through mechanical devices so he wouldn't have to face staff. He wrote letters in blue ink to long-dead monarchs. The government, alarmed and probably exhausted, orchestrated a coup, declaring him insane based on medical opinions written by men who'd never examined him in person. Convenient. He was arrested and confined to Berg Castle, under the watch of a psychiatrist and a single servant. 2 days later, both Ludwig and the psychiatrist were found dead in shallow water near the castle, officially drowned. But Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and the autopsy showed no water in his lungs. The doctor's body showed signs of a struggle. Was it murder, suicide, an escape gone wrong? No one knows. What we do know is that when Ludwig died, his castles were incomplete, his heart was probably shattered, and his secret longings remained hidden behind velvet curtains and plaster cherubs. Today, tourists flock to Neuschwanstein, the most visited castle in Europe, to take selfies and pretend they're in a fairy tale. But that fairy tale was built by a man who spent his life running from reality, a king who wanted love, not war, and ended up dying for dreaming too hard. The scholarly verdict is still up in the air. Some frame Ludwig as a tragic figure, a queer icon suffocated by conservative society. Others call him a delusional spendthrift who nearly bankrupted Bavaria. The truth, of course, is somewhere between the swans and the shadows. He was a man out of time, surrounded by rules he couldn't follow and walls he couldn't climb over. So he built new ones, taller, prettier, and so lonely they echoed. Next we travel to Russia, to a time of revolution, mysticism and forbidden passion. You're about to meet a doomed royal couple whose devotion burned bright even as their empire crumbled around them. Love letters, bathhouse rumours, and the whispers of Rasputin. Yes, Nicholas and Alexandra await. The candles are flickering low in the winter palace, and the marble floors seem colder than usual. You're in Russia, the last days of imperial grandeur, and the air tastes like something's about to break. Beneath layers of fur and brocade, behind closed doors guarded by men with moustaches and rifles, lies one of history's most tragic and surprisingly steamy royal romances. Nicholas there and Alexandra Feodorovna, the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia. Their empire was collapsing, their people were starving, and revolution was literally marching toward their doorstep. But behind all that, a deep, passionate, occasionally obsessive love story full of whispered letters, spiritual entanglements, and more than a few rumours that still make historians raise an eyebrow. When Nicholas met Alexandra, born Alex of Hesse, a German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria, it wasn't love at first sight. It was more like mild, awkward interest. He was quiet, formal, and emotionally reserved. She was shy, devout, and deeply nervous in public. But over time that turned into something electric. Nicholas fell for her hard, and in an era when royal marriages were rarely about affection, he actually married for love, against his family's advice. Bold move, Nicky. They wrote to each other constantly, even when they were in the same palace. Their letters, some of which survive, are steamy. Not in a vulgar way, but in a kind of repressed Victorian sensuality meets devotional clinginess way. Alexandra called him my own beloved one, my sunshine, and once described herself as melting into his arms like snow in May. Nicholas, in return, wrote about longing to be near her, to kiss her, to share her bed without all the interruptions of state. You can almost hear the sighs between the lines. And make no mistake, they were physically obsessed with each other. They had 5 children together, and if court gossip is to be believed, they were not shy about nighttime activities. One courtier claimed to have accidentally walked in on them entangled on a divan like newlyweds. Another swore the imperial couple were known to spend hours locked away from everyone, ignoring calls and knocking servants. For a couple famous for their public stiffness, they were very private behind closed doors, and probably very sweaty. But the deeper their personal love grew, the more detached they became from the world falling apart around them. Alexandra, never popular with the Russian people due to her German origins and icy demeanour, increasingly leaned into religious mysticism and clung to Nicholas like a lifeline. She became obsessed with Grigori Rasputin, the infamous mad monk and wandering mystic who claimed he could heal their son Alexei's haemophilia, a secret illness that could bring down the dynasty if ever revealed. Rasputin's role in their lives was complicated. Officially, he was a spiritual advisor. Unofficially, he had Alexandra completely entranced. She believed he was a holy man sent by God. Nicholas, though sceptical at first, allowed Rasputin to stay close because every time the monk prayed over Alexei, the boy's condition seemed to improve. Coincidence? Maybe Rasputin was a master of psychological manipulation. Either way, he became a fixture in their private life. Now here's the fringe fact. Rasputin and Alexandra exchanged intimate letters, and by intimate, we mean just one step away from biblical. She referred to him as our friend, but the tone bordered on romantic. "I kiss your hands," she once wrote. "I lay my weary head upon your shoulder." And some letters from Rasputin to the Tsarina included phrases like, "I long to touch your white body," and "You are more dear to me than heaven itself." Romantic, platonic, cryptic monk speak? Historians are still arguing, and while most scholars believe their relationship was non-sexual, the rumours were so intense that the Russian press openly accused Rasputin of sleeping with the Tsarina, and possibly her daughters. Whether or not there was truth to the gossip, the perception destroyed what was left of their public image. The people believed Alexandra had fallen under Rasputin's sexual spell, that Nicholas was being ruled from the bedroom by both his wife and a grubby mystic with bad hygiene and suspicious hands. At a time when revolution was rumbling, this was political dynamite. Their love, once their strength, had become their blind spot. Even within the palace, their love bubble was impenetrable. Nicholas leaned so hard on Alexandra for advice that she was effectively co-ruling during World War I, despite having zero diplomatic skill and a flair for paranoia. Their letters during this period became more desperate, more tender. She called him my treasure. He called her wifey dear, and neither seemed able to process the fact that the country was slipping through their fingers. And let's not forget the bathhouse rumours. According to fringe gossip in post-revolution Europe, the imperial couple had a private Turkish-style bath chamber in the Alexander Palace, reportedly lined with marble and equipped with a discreet lock that no servant dared to touch. It was their refuge, where steam, warmth and flesh replaced cold court politics. Whether or not this chamber was the site of sensual retreats or simply a very fancy spa room remains unconfirmed. But you know how rumours work. The more decadent it sounded, the more people believed it. By 1917, their fairy tale was over. Revolution exploded, the royal family was placed under house arrest. Even in captivity, Nicholas and Alexandra remained devoted, sleeping in the same bed, holding hands during daily walks in the garden, praying side by side. And in July 1918, in a grim basement in Yekaterinburg, they died that way too, together, executed by the Bolshevik guards in a frenzy of gunfire and bayonet thrusts. The love letters didn't save them, the loyalty didn't save them, but somehow the intimacy between them still echoes louder than the revolution that killed them. Historians remain torn on their legacy. Some see Nicholas and Alexandra as tragic romantics, victims of a world they didn't understand. Others see them as arrogant, disconnected royals whose love made them weak and willfully blind. But no one denies the passion. No one questions the intensity of their bond. They might have lost an empire, but they never lost each other. Next, we turn to a royal woman who had no time for empires, husbands, or rules. She weaponized beauty like a saber, kept secrets better than a crypt, and rode horseback with more grace than any man at court. Prepare yourself for the dazzling, obsessive, and dangerous life of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Or, as history remembers her, Sisi. There she is, Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, standing like a ghost in the middle of her own legend. Hair down to her knees, waist cinched to a terrifying 19 inches, face like a portrait, and eyes that could freeze an entire ballroom. She was empress, yes, but also something more complicated. A tragic icon of obsessive self-beautification, emotional rebellion and whispered scandal. And while the history books try to paint her as a misunderstood beauty with a crown and a case of wanderlust, the truth is she weaponized her allure, courted controversy in quiet ways and used her body, and her distance from it, as both armour and bait. Let's rewind to her origin. Born into Bavarian nobility in 1837, Sisi wasn't supposed to be queen material. That job was meant for her older sister Helena. But when young Emperor Franz Joseph met Sisi, just 16, shy and dazzling, he immediately dropped protocol and proposed to her instead. A romantic twist? Maybe. Or maybe he just fell for the only girl in the room who didn't seem desperate to marry him. Either way, Sisi was thrown into the Habsburg court before she'd even figured out how to handle a corset, let alone an empire. From the start, she hated court life. The rules, the scrutiny, the constant pressure to produce heirs and keep her ankles perfectly crossed. She gave birth to her first child within a year, and then was promptly cut off from the baby by her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who believed Sisi was too young and too wild to raise a proper Habsburg heir. This emotional robbery became one of many cracks in her psyche. In response, Sisi didn't scream, she didn't fight, she withdrew, and then she began to obsess. Her first obsession, control over her body. At a time when most royal women were expected to go soft and sedentary, Sisi turned her body into a temple of discipline. She ate almost nothing, subsisting on broth, oranges, or raw milk. She weighed herself daily. She walked for hours, rode horses like a man, took cold baths, slept with raw veal masks on her face to preserve her skin. Her hair, famously ankle length, required 3 hours of maintenance every day, and reportedly had a personal maid who did little else but brush and condition it. To be beautiful was to be untouchable, and untouchable was the only way she felt safe. Now, let's get into the sex rumours, because you don't become Europe's most mythologized empress without people whispering behind fans. Despite being married to Franz Joseph, Sisi was almost never with him. After giving him a few heirs, including the doomed Crown Prince Rudolf, whose death in a murder-suicide pact at Mayerling would haunt her forever, she essentially removed herself from his bed, his court, and his political life. She travelled constantly, from Hungary to Greece to Switzerland, with a rotating entourage and no real explanation. People began to speculate. One recurring name in the gossip circuit, Count Andrassy, a dashing Hungarian nobleman and close confidant of Sisi. He was known for his charisma, his political wit, and his deeply personal relationship with the Empress. Some said he was the love of her life. Others insisted their bond was purely emotional. And of course, a few took the liberty of assuming they'd had a child together. A girl named Marie Valerie. Born during Sisi's pro-Hungarian phase and often referred to as the Hungarian child. Was Franz Joseph the father? Officially, yes. Unofficially, there's just enough weird tension to keep the theory alive. Fringe fact time, there's a rumoured portrait of Sisi, never publicly displayed, where she's partially nude, hair unbound, gazing into the mirror like she's daring someone to stop her. If it exists, it's hidden in a vault somewhere. But the idea that she posed that way, it fits. She was known to walk around in Greek-style tunics, or even some men's riding pants, defying every rule of imperial femininity. She lived like a moving statue, admired, distant and deliberately unknowable. Her husband, Franz Joseph, was patient, almost bafflingly so. He adored her, even as she emotionally drifted into the mist. He tolerated her disappearances, her refusals to attend court, her silence, her literal vanishing acts. Some say he had affairs out of loneliness. Others say he remained devoted, even as she turned herself into a kind of living myth. But no matter how much he tried to hold on to her, Sisi floated out of reach. She wrote melancholy poetry. She refused portraits after age 30. She avoided mirrors, even as she remained obsessed with her reflection. She became, in many ways, a study in contradictions, self-absorbed and self-loathing, visible and invisible, pure and deeply sensual without ever being openly sexual. Her later years were defined by tragedy and movement. After Rudolph's death, she wore mourning black for the rest of her life. She covered her face with fans and veils. She travelled constantly as if staying still might kill her, and then, in 1898, while walking anonymously along the promenade in Geneva, she was stabbed in the heart by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He hadn't even known who she was, just wanted to make a political statement. She collapsed. Her corset so tight it held her upright for minutes before she realised she was bleeding to death. Her death was strangely symbolic. For a woman who had spent her entire life hiding behind screens, veils and other myths, she was finally exposed in the most violent way possible. The public mourned. Statues went up. Romantics swooned. But no one really understood her. Maybe she didn't even understand herself. Scholars still wrestle with Sisi. Was she a proto-feminist, rejecting the roles assigned to her? A narcissist, obsessed with control and image? A tragic victim of dynastic machinery? Or simply a deeply sensitive woman trying to disappear without anyone noticing? What we do know is that her sex life, more absent than active, became a scandal by default, because she refused to perform her role as imperial wife, because she didn't want to be touched, because she dared to belong to herself. Coming up next, we circle back to England to meet a king who didn't pretend to love women, because he loved men. In a time when even a rumour of same-sex desire could ruin a life, he ruled openly surrounded by his favourites, leaving behind a trail of love letters, courtly gossip, and one very awkward historical debate. Meet King James I of England, and the men who may have ruled his heart. The court of King James III of England smells faintly of pipe smoke, damp velvet and danger. It's the early 1600s, and the country is still catching its breath after the wild soap opera that was Elizabeth I now. With a new king on the throne, the first from Scotland no less, England hopes for peace, unity, and maybe a touch of dignity. Instead, they get a man who loves poetry more than politics, spends money like it's going out of style, and, most controversially, keeps a rotating cast of beautiful young men suspiciously close to his throne, and to his bedchambers. Welcome to the reign of King James I, lover of the Bible, the theatre, and possibly in men. Born in 56, James was the son of the tragic Mary, Queen of Scots, and her short-lived second husband, Lord Darnley. His childhood was pure trauma, murder, coups, kidnappings, and a mother executed by her cousin. Raised in the cold Calvinist world of Scottish politics, James grew up learning how to survive betrayal, which maybe explains his lifelong obsession with absolute loyalty. And for James, loyalty often came wrapped in a handsome face, a noble title, and very tight-fitting hose. Let's get to the heart of the scandal. James married Anne of Denmark, and together they had 7 children, 3 of whom survived into adulthood. So yes, he fulfilled his royal reproductive duties, but that didn't stop the rumours. From his early 20s until his death, James surrounded himself with a string of male favourites, young nobles who received extravagant titles, lands, and the kind of affectionate letters that make even modern readers blush. The first, and arguably the most intense, was Esme Stuart, a French nobleman who arrived in Scotland when James was just 13. Esme was 37, charming, Catholic, and very well dressed. James immediately fell under his spell, calling him his dear dad and lover, and showering him with political favour. Their relationship scandalised the Scottish court. Ministers panicked. They accused Esme of corrupting the young king, not just politically, but morally. Esme was eventually exiled, but James was inconsolable. He wrote that his heart was crushed with sorrow. Years later, he still referred to him as the best loved of all. After becoming King of England in 1603, James continued the pattern. Enter Robert Carr, a stunning young man who literally fell off a horse in front of the king during a tournament. James took one look at his broken leg and his well-shaped cheekbones, and said essentially, yes, that one. He had Carr nursed back to health, educated and launched him into power. Soon Carr was Earl of Somerset, and James was writing him letters like, I desire only to live within your heart, and die in your arms. That's not political friendship, that's a romance novel in progress. But Carr wasn't exactly a genius. He relied on scheming advisors and eventually got caught in a scandal involving poison, blackmail and murder. Specifically the suspicious death of Sir Thomas Overbury, who had insulted Carr's mistress and later wife, Frances Howard. The entire case exploded into a courtroom circus. James tried to protect Carr, but it was clear the bloom had fallen off that rose. So naturally, he found a new one. His final and most infamous favourite was George Villiers, a man so attractive he was described as the handsomest bodied man in all England. James was 50 when they met. George was 21. The king made him Duke of Buckingham, showered him with riches, and once told Parliament, Christ had his John and I have my George. Yes, he really said that, in public, during a government session. Subtlety was not his strong suit. Now, let's pause for your fringe fact. James referred to Buckingham in official documents as my sweet child and wife, and to himself as husband. This was not a time when men threw around pet names like that for other men, not without consequences. The love letters between them are some of the most emotionally open in English royal history. In one, James writes, "I will ever live and die your loving husband." George responds with, "I rest forever your faithful and loyal servant and lover." You tell me that sound like policy talk? Of course, the debate rages on. Were these relationships sexual or just intensely affectionate? Some historians insist James's love was platonic, filtered through the flamboyant language of Renaissance male friendship. Others argue there's too much smoke and too many pet names for there not to have been fire. Still others suggest James's emotional neediness made him blur the line between paternal, romantic and political relationships. Whatever the case, Buckingham was there when James died in 1625, holding his hand and weeping. And Anne of Denmark? She stayed in the background. Their marriage was polite, distant and increasingly strained as James grew more dependent on his male companions. Anne had her own rumoured lovers, though with much less documentation. The two lived mostly apart in later years, and when she died, James didn't show much emotion. When Buckingham nearly died of illness, however, James broke down completely. Make of that what you will. Critics at the time, and many after, accused James of corruption, favouritism and moral decay. The king who gave us the King James Bible also gave us an entire generation of government run by beautiful young men in feathered doublets. Not exactly what the Puritans had in mind, but James, ever self-assured, once said, "I am the husband of one wife, but I have loved many." Ambiguous, poetic. And so James. In the end, James left behind a complicated legacy, a new royal dynasty, the Bible translation that would define English Christianity, and a trail of love letters that make modern historians squirm like they're reading someone else's text messages. Whether or not he ever consummated those relationships, he loved deeply, dramatically, and unapologetically. Next we head toward the defining royal love story of the 20th century. A king, an American divorcee, a constitutional crisis, and a royal family so scandalised they exiled their own. Buckle up for pearls, paparazzi, and abdication letters. It's time for Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, the affair that broke a crown. The world holds its breath in 1936 as the King of England stands before a microphone, his voice smooth and clipped, trembling slightly as he announces he is giving up the throne. Not because of scandal in the treasury or military failure, not because of rebellion, but because he's in love with a woman his country refuses to accept. That woman is Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite with a sharp tongue and sharper cheekbones. The king is Edward VIII, once the golden boy of the British monarchy. Their affair ignites a royal crisis so explosive it doesn't just shake the palace, it rips through the very idea of what a king is allowed to want. Welcome to the most glamorous, gossiped-about royal sex scandal of the 20th century, the one with abdication, exile and lingerie catalogues. Let's rewind. Edward, called David by friends and family, was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary. Born into stiff Edwardian protocol and bred for duty, he was never quite comfortable in the role. Too emotional, too rebellious, too modern. He served in World War I, travelled widely, and quickly developed a reputation for womanising. He had affairs with married women, flirted with chorus girls, and wrote moody letters about loneliness and longing. He was the kind of prince who made palisades clutch their teacups a little tighter. Then came Wallis. She wasn't a conventional beauty, but she was magnetic. American, witty, confident, with a low voice and a knack for getting under a man's skin, in all the ways you're thinking. She'd already divorced one husband and was working on her second when she entered Edward's orbit. At first, she was part of the cocktail party set, just another fashionable woman in the room. But something about her cut up through the prince's melancholy. Maybe it was her disregard for royal etiquette. Maybe it was her ability to make fun of him to his face. Either way, by 1934, they were lovers, and by 1935 they were inseparable. Now, here's where it all goes to scandal. Wallis wasn't just a divorcee, she was an American divorcee, still married to her second husband when she started seeing Edward. And Edward? He wasn't just smitten, he was obsessed. He brought her to Balmoral. He introduced her to the family. He defied every royal protocol by flaunting the relationship in public. He called her my beloved and the only woman who ever mattered. And when he became king in January 1936, he made it crystal clear he wanted to marry her, not keep her as a mistress, not install her quietly in a country home. Marry her. Cue national meltdown. The British government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, went into panic mode. The Church of England, of which Edward was now the supreme governor, flat out forbade the idea. The monarchy simply could not allow a king to marry a twice-divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands. It wasn't just immoral in their eyes, it was constitutionally impossible. Politicians warned of government collapse, Commonwealth nations threatened rebellion. The press, which had initially kept quiet under a sort of gentleman's agreement, exploded with headlines. And Edward? He refused to give her up. Fringe fact time, Wallis was rumoured to have had sexual techniques learned in Shanghai brothels. Yep, the popular and totally unverifiable theory was that during her first marriage, spent in China, she learned bedroom secrets that left Edward completely enthralled. Whether or not there's truth to that, the idea stuck. People couldn't understand why the king would give up everything for this woman, unless, of course, she had some other worldly skill set. It was misogynistic, yes, but also part of the public's desperate attempt to rationalise why a king would choose passion over power. And he did. In December 1936, after months of negotiation and pressure, Edward VIII abdicated the throne. His broadcast was short, formal, and devastating. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. Just like that, he became Duke of Windsor, and the crown passed to his stammering, dutiful younger brother, George VI, father of the future Queen Elizabeth II. The exile was both glamorous and awkward. Edward married Wallis in a private ceremony in France in 1937. No member of the royal family attended. The royal household never forgave him. And Wallis, she never received the title of Her Royal Highness, a petty detail that stung more than she ever admitted. They lived a life of parties, vacations, and social limbo, too royal for the common folk, too scandalous for the crown. Wallis wrote about how much she hated being a hostess of exile, always smiling, always being polite, while the world whispered that she had ruined a king. Edward, for his part, seemed content, at least on the surface. He spent the rest of his life writing memoirs, dressing impeccably and chasing the high of being adored. But the question lingered. Had he given up too much? There's also the Nazi elephant in the room. Edward and Wallis visited Hitler in 1937. Yes, that Hitler. The photographs are real. They shook hands, smiled, even toured parts of Germany. Historians have argued for years about what exactly they were doing there. Was it naivete, diplomacy, ideological sympathy? Either way, it added a dark, queasy layer to an already complicated story. Back to the romance. Despite everything, exile, scorn, rumours of affairs, they stayed together until Edward's death in 1972. Wallis lived another 14 years, increasingly isolated, her health failing, her wealth mismanaged by the shady advisors. When she died in 1986, she was buried beside Edward in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, beneath a simple headstone. In the end, the woman who couldn't be queen lies just a few yards away from the family that exiled her. So what's the legacy? Some see their love as selfish, an indulgent king derailed by lust. Others see it as romantic defiance, a man choosing love over obligation, desire over duty. But one thing's for sure, Edward and Wallis changed the monarchy forever. They exposed its fragility, they showed that even the crown couldn't stand against passion, and they left behind a story more seductive than anything Buckingham Palace could have ever approved. Next, we're heading from royalty's abdicator-in-chief to the emperor who thought love could conquer Europe, until it didn't. Yes, we're stepping into the war tents and bedrooms of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose obsession with Josephine set off a chain reaction of affairs, betrayals, and perfume-laced heartbreak. You're standing in a candlelit room in post-revolutionary France. The air is thick with perfume and politics, and somewhere behind the damask curtains, there's a general who's rewriting the rules of war and love at the same time. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte, and he's on his way to becoming Emperor of the French, but tonight his pen moves faster than his sword. He's writing to his wife, Josephine, with so much desperate longing it could melt a bayonet. "I wake filled with thoughts of you," he writes. "Your portrait and the intoxicating evening which we spent yesterday have left my senses in turmoil." Now that sounds sweet. Till you realise she's probably in someone else's bed while he's writing it. This is not a fairy tale. It's a battlefield of ego, erotics, and empire. Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais in 1795. She was older, widowed, elegant, and socially savvy, everything he was not. At 32, she'd already lived through the French Revolution, survived prison, lost her first husband to the guillotine, and seduced her way back into the upper echelons of Parisian society. He, meanwhile, was a socially awkward 26-year-old Corsican general with bad teeth and a tendency to overshare in his letters. But when he met her, something clicked, or maybe snapped. Their romance exploded like one of his artillery salvos. He proposed after just a few months, and they were married in a small civil ceremony with a falsified marriage certificate, because Josephine lied about her ages to appear younger, and Napoleon lied to appear older. So yes, even emperors fudged the numbers on their dating profiles. From the beginning, their marriage was a mess of passion and betrayal. While Napoleon was off fighting in Italy and conquering cities by breakfast, Josephine stayed in Paris, soaking in her celebrity and taking a lover, a young cavalry officer named Hippolyte Charles. The affair was so poorly hidden that Napoleon's fellow officers were joking about it over a breakfast. The gossip reached him fast. Cue the angry, tortured letters. And let's pause here for your fringe fact. In one particularly spicy letter, Napoleon writes, "Do not wash yourself. I am coming back, and I want to smell your natural scent." Yep. The man who crowned himself emperor was also very into unwashed Josephine. Historians debate whether this was typical of the era, or just Napoleon's personal kink, but either way, it's a scented snapshot of a very intense, very human desire. But the betrayal cut deep. Napoleon was humiliated, and while he continued to profess love, he didn't hesitate to return the favour. Once his campaigns took him farther abroad, he developed a long string of mistresses, many of them local conquests, literally. One notable affair was with Pauline Faure, a striking young woman who followed her husband to Egypt. Napoleon quickly had her husband reassigned and claimed her for himself. She became known as Napoleon's Cleopatra because nothing says imperial ego like rebranding your lover as a literal goddess. Still, it was always Josephine he circled back to, even when he was furious, even when she lied, even when he knew the marriage was unravelling. There was something about her voice, her presence, her sheer ability to not care in the face of his volcanic emotions, that fascinated him. He was emotional, explosive, dramatic. She was graceful, indifferent, maddeningly elusive. Their letters read like therapy sessions written in iambic prose. "I do not love you, on the contrary I detest you," he writes in one. "You are a vile, mean, beastly woman." That was in the same letter where he also says he wants to hold her forever. Yes, Napoleon invented the "I hate you, boy, but love you" relationship decades before it hit Instagram. By 1804, as Napoleon prepared to crown himself emperor, he was still madly in love, but he needed an heir. And Josephine, after multiple failed pregnancies, couldn't give him one. The pressure to produce a legitimate successor outweighed even his obsession with her. So in 1810, he did the unthinkable. He divorced her, in public, with ceremony and tears. Both of them cried during the announcement. It wasn't just political, it was heartbreak on display for the entire empire. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, a Habsburg princess who was young, fertile and deeply uninterested in him. She gave him a son, Napoleon II, and then promptly stopped responding to his letters after his political downfall. So basically, rebound marriage, no real spark, classic empire implosion material. And what about Josephine? After the divorce, she didn't collapse into mourning. She retreated to Malmaison, her private estate outside Paris, surrounded herself with art, exotic plants, and a rotating cast of socialites. She never remarried, but she knew how to keep her legend alive. Everyone still wanted to visit her, and Napoleon, he still wrote, still asked about her. Even as his empire burned and his armies froze in Russia, he never quite got her out of his system. Fringe theory? Some believe Josephine used love magic, spells, potions, or perfumes laced with herbs designed to entrance and bind. There's little evidence, but the myth persists, probably because no one could understand how a battle-hardened alpha male dictator was reduced to a puddle of longing whenever she so much as entered a room. She wasn't especially beautiful, she wasn't loyal, but she owned him, heart, soul and body. When Josephine died in 1814, Napoleon was in exile. He wept when he heard the news. He said, "It is a wound that will never heal." And after his own death on St. Helena in 1821, They found among his belongings a lock of her hair. Not his son's, not his second wife's, Josephine's, right to the end. So what do we make of them? Scholars still argue. Was she his weakness, his muse, his greatest mistake? Was he a romantic in a general's uniform, or a tyrant undone by bad timing and great sex? Maybe both, maybe neither. But what's undeniable is this. In the middle of world-changing conquests, royal coronations, and military campaigns that redrew the map of Europe, Napoleon's biggest battlefield was always the one between his obsession and her indifference. Next we travel farther east, to a different empire where love was perfume, poetry was political, and harems weren't cages, but palaces of intrigue. Welcome to the sensual, secretive world of the Mughal emperors, where royal desire came laced with rose oil and daggers. You step into a palace where the scent of sandalwood mixes with rosewater, and the walls are thick with silk, secrets, and stories. Mughal India, where emperors ruled not just with armies and edicts, but with poetry, jewels, and bedrooms designed like dreamscapes. Here, love wasn't hidden, it was elevated. And in the inner chambers of red sandstone fortresses and marble mausoleums, sensuality wasn't shameful, it was divine strategy. This is the world of the Mughals and their perfumed harems, a royal microcosm of power, passion, and politics where the line between courtship and control was blurred by incense smoke. Let's start with the big picture. The Mughals, descendants of Genghis Khan and Timur, ruled most of the Indian subcontinent from the 16th to the 18th century, creating one of the most artistically rich and sexually nuanced royal cultures in history. These weren't just warriors or administrators, they were poet kings, obsessed with beauty, architecture, and the delicate art of romance. Their harems weren't simply dens of pleasure, they were sophisticated political institutions, home to hundreds, sometimes thousands of women. Wives, concubines, attendants, musicians, dancers, and mothers of emperors. But don't let the word harem fool you. This wasn't some chaotic swarm of silk-clad women waiting to be summoned. The zenana, as it was called, was a self-contained world with its own hierarchy, economy, rules, and politics. Women inside were highly educated, deeply influential, and in some cases, more powerful than the men outside. It was a place of restriction, but also of remarkable control. The emperor's chief consort, or Padshah Begum, was queen in all but name. Below her were various wives, often from noble or royal families, and concubines, some of whom wielded immense sway. One concubine, Nur Yehan, was so powerful she co-ruled with her husband, Emperor Jahangir, issuing royal decrees in her own name, appearing on coins and dominating court politics. All from behind the veil. Sensuality meets statecraft. And yes, there was plenty of sensuality. Mughal emperors were known for their exquisite taste in lovers. Emperors like Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan had massive harems, but they weren't just collecting women like exotic birds. They wanted conversation, intelligence, artistry. A woman who could write poetry in Persian was often more prized than one with perfect features, and when you did catch an emperor's eye, the rewards were immense. Land grants, titles, influence, and in some cases, motherhood of the heir to the throne. Fringe fact. The Mughal emperors were known to bathe with their consorts in elaborate pools lined with marble and scented with jasmine oil. Some had private water channels that ran through the harem suites, designed to cool the floors and keep the mood, let's say, fluid. There are records of floating flower petals, wine, musicians playing from behind screens, and custom perfumes made for each woman based on her astrological chart. Imagine your romantic future tied to whether Venus was in retrograde and whether your bathwater smelled like cardamom. Of course, not every night in the zenana was poetic bliss. There was jealousy, sabotage, and deadly rivalry. Rumours swirled of poisoned cosmetics, whispered curses, and dancers who conveniently tripped on staircases after catching too much royal attention. Being beautiful wasn't enough. You had to be clever, ruthless, and politically tuned in. It was chess with veils. One of the most iconic Mughal love stories is that of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. She wasn't just another wife, she was the wife, beloved, trusted, and perpetually pregnant, 14 children, 7 surviving. Their bond was deep, sensual, and spiritual. Spiritual. When she died in childbirth in 1631, Shah Jahan was devastated. He withdrew from court, wore white for a year, and built her a tomb that became one of the most famous structures in the world, the Taj Mahal. But here's the little-known detail. He also built a mirror palace, the Sheesh Mahal, where reflections danced like ghosts in candlelight, and it's said he once walked through it alone, surrounded by the illusion of her presence. A man with 1,000 women, heartbroken by one. That said, the Mughals weren't saints. Some emperors treated their harems like collections, some were tyrannical. There are accounts of women being bought, gifted, or taken during conquest. Consent, as we understand it today, was not always part of the equation, but within those constraints, many harem women found ways to wield power, some becoming property managers, military advisors, or patrons of the arts. They influenced fashion, food, language, and diplomacy, all from within walls they could never leave. One scholar called the harem a cage made of pearls. You couldn't leave, but you could rule it, if you were smart, and seductive, and lucky. Let's not forget male attendants, either. The harem was guarded by eunuchs, castrated servants who acted as go-betweens, spies and confidants. Some wielded enormous power, controlling who saw whom and when, and occasionally those lines blurred. There are whispers, never confirmed, of emotional or even romantic entanglements between eunuchs and the women they protected. Was it comfort? Love? Strategy? Like much of the Zenana, it remains locked in a cloud of rumours, spices and poetry. The Mughal emperors also loved to document. Miniature paintings, delicate, jewel-toned, impossibly detailed, show glimpses into harem life. Musicians performing, lovers whispering under moonlight, peacocks in the background, silk draped casually off a shoulder. These weren't porno scenes. They were aesthetic celebrations of intimacy and desire. Every detail mattered. Even arousal, when painted, looked like art. Today we often view harems as oppressive, but the Mughal Zenana was a paradox, a place of restriction that also bred influence, a sensual retreat and a prison, a space where power was wrapped in silks and love was measured in poetry, perfume and political leverage. So the next time someone reduces royal harems to just a bunch of concubines lying around eating grapes, remind them this was a chessboard, with lipstick, and poison, and the occasional poem that could decide the fate of an empire. Now, from one Queen of Hearts to another, we head to Cleopatra, a ruler who turned seduction into statecraft and made even Rome bend a little. Her lovers weren't just men, they were entire empires. You arrive on the banks of the Nile, where the air is heavy with incense and heat, and history doesn't whisper, it purrs. The torches flicker against walls of golden hieroglyphs, and somewhere behind a curtain of linen, a queen is waiting. Not just a queen, a goddess in mortal form, at least if you asked her priests. Her name is Cleopatra VII Philopator, last of the Ptolemies, and she's about to rewrite the meaning of royal seduction. You think you know her, don't you? You picture eyeliner, snakes, lounging in silk, but Cleopatra wasn't some decadent temptress slinking around in slow motion. She was a political genius who used sex not as pleasure, but as a strategy sharp enough to cut Rome in half. Let's start with a little context. Cleopatra didn't inherit a stable throne, she inherited a flaming dumpster of a dynasty. The Ptolemies, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great, were incestuous, paranoid, and constantly at war with each other. Her own siblings tried to kill her more than once. Egypt itself was hanging on by a thread, broke, squeezed by Roman debt collectors, and at risk of becoming just another Roman province. Cleopatra needed an alliance, a powerful one, and if she had to crawl into a Roman general's tent to secure it, well, so be it. That general was Julius Caesar. Their first meeting is already the stuff of legend. According to the juiciest version, Cleopatra, exiled and desperate, had herself smuggled into Caesar's palace rolled up inside a carpet. When the rug was unfurled, out she popped, dusted in linen and charm, smiling up at the most powerful man in the world. Whether it was a rug or a linen sack is still debated by scholars, but the result was the same. Caesar was hooked. She was young, about 21, brilliant, fluent in over half a dozen languages, and not afraid to flirt with power. They became lovers almost immediately. She stayed with Caesar in Alexandria for months and gave birth to a son, Caesarion, a baby that made the Roman Senate extremely uncomfortable. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed. She wasn't subtle about it either. She paraded through the streets in a golden barge dressed like the goddess Isis, with her child in her arms. She stayed in one of Caesar's estates, and it was widely rumoured she wanted him to divorce his Roman wife and marry her, making their son his heir. Not a great look in a city that had laws against marriage to foreigners. Caesar got stabbed in the Senate before any of that could happen. Coincidence? We'll never know. But Cleopatra wasn't done. Next came Mark Antony, Caesar's old friend, party animal and Roman warlord. If Caesar was a chess player, Antony was a bar brawler. He summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus to explain her political allegiance. She responded by sailing up the river on a massive gilded barge, dressed again as Isis, surrounded by musicians, incense and courtesans dressed as nymphs. Antony, famously weak to aesthetics and wine, was ensnared before dinner was served. They became inseparable. And this wasn't some quiet-side relationship. They hosted lavish feasts in Alexandria, drank themselves under the table, and even founded a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, a kind of royal frat house where the dress code was tunics and poor decisions. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, and he gave her territories, titles, and public acknowledgement. He even divorced his Roman wife to be with her, which, spoiler alert, did not go over well with Rome. The gossip back in the capital was nuclear. The Roman Senate accused Cleopatra of witchcraft, manipulation, and unholy seduction. They painted her as a foreign temptress corrupting a once great general. Augustus, then Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's rival, used the scandal to full advantage, launching a PR campaign from hell. He claimed Antony was giving away Roman lands to his mistress, calling Caesarion the rightful heir to Caesar, and planning to move the capital of Rome to Alexandria. So naturally, it ended in war. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE wasn't just a naval engagement. It was the climax of the most high-stakes love affair in ancient history. Cleopatra was there, with her own fleet, but as things went sideways, she made a break for it. Antony followed. They lost. They fled to Egypt. And then came the tragic theatrical finale. Antony, misled into thinking Cleopatra had died by suicide, fell on his sword. When she found out, she locked herself in her mausoleum with his body and began plotting her own death. The most famous version is also the most romanticised, that she let an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, bite her on the breast. But there are other theories. Poison hidden in a hairpin, or even a cocktail of toxins smuggled in with fruit. However it happened, she died as she lived, carefully curated and on her own terms. Fringe fact, according to Roman historian Plutarch, Cleopatra once bet Mark Antony she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal, then proceeded to dissolve a pearl earring in vinegar and drink it. Science suggests the vinegar couldn't have dissolved the pearl that fast, but again, legend doesn't care about chemistry. Cleopatra knew that part of her power came from creating awe, even if it meant inventing myths around herself. And that's the thing, Cleopatra's sexuality wasn't passive, she didn't fall for powerful men. She chose them, manipulated them, built her political future on their egos, and used love like a sword. She was not defined by her lovers, they were defined by her. And while men across the Roman world wrung their hands over her influence, she ruled for over 2 decades, maintained Egypt's independence, and left a legacy that still smells faintly of myrrh and revolution. Was she a romantic? Maybe. But she was also a master tactician. In a world where women weren't allowed to sit at the table, she seduced the whole banquet. Next, we leave the thrones and go off script into the world of royal illegitimate children. Because for every official heir, there's often a shadow sibling lurking in the margins, born of liaisons behind curtains, forgotten mistresses, and the kind of secrets you only admit to after a few drinks and a day test. There's an old saying, where there's a crown, there's a secret baby. You've seen the portraits, the official heirs, the powdered hair, the smug little royal faces, but behind them, hiding in country estates tucked into private schools, or buried in court records marked confidential, are the illegitimate children of monarchs, the unofficial bloodlines, the whisper-born sons and daughters that royal lovers didn't always deny, but rarely claimed in public. Some were elevated, some were exiled, a few even rose to immense power, but all of them were born out of moments the crown would rather you didn't ask about. Let's not sugarcoat it. Kings were not great at monogamy. For most of history, marriage was a political contract, and mistresses were part of the furniture. Sex was not always about love, or even desire. Sometimes it was duty, sometimes boredom, sometimes conquest. But what it often led to, aside from very tense morning-after conversations, was children. Lots of them. And while some were quietly paid off or hidden away, others were acknowledged, educated, and brought into court life like semi-royal accessories. Let's meet a few of the more legendary ones. Start with King Charles II of England, whose official legacy might be restoration and wigs, but unofficially, he was Dad of the Century. Despite having no legitimate children with his wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, Charles acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children by 7 different mistresses. Yes, 7. And those are just the ones we know. He gave them titles, lands, and in some cases massive influence. His son by Barbara Villiers, named Henry Fitzroy, became the Duke of Grafton. Another son, Charles Lennox, by Louise de Keroualle, became the Duke of Richmond, a title still held today by his descendants. Fringe fact, Charles once joked that he was the father of his people in more ways than one. He was self-aware enough to know he'd never produce a legitimate heir, so he just went with the chaos. He adored his children, regardless of their scandalous origins, and made sure they had lives of privilege, just not the throne. Now, not all monarchs were that generous. Some, like Louis XIV of France, were more selective. The Sun King had at least 16 illegitimate children by several mistresses, including the infamous Madame de Montespan. He legitimated some of them, especially the ones born from long-standing lovers, and married them into noble families to secure alliances. Others were quietly shuffled into convents or vanished into arranged marriages with disturbingly older aristocrats. One of his daughters became the Duchess of Orleans, marrying into the royal circle she technically didn't belong to. It was a reminder that in France bloodlines were flexible, if you had the right mother. Sometimes, though, the illegitimate children really shook the system, like James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, the son of Charles II and Lucy Walter. Monmouth wasn't just rich and handsome, he was ambitious. After Charles II's death, he led a full-scale rebellion claiming that he, not Charles's brother James, was the rightful heir. He insisted that his parents had been secretly married, making him legitimate. The rebellion failed, of course, and Monmouth was executed, but for a hot minute, an illegitimate son nearly overthrew the crown. And then there's Russia, where illegitimacy was practically a lifestyle. Catherine the Great had lovers into her 60s, and while she never publicly acknowledged any illegitimate children, whispers never stopped. Her long-standing relationship with Grigory Orlov, for instance, is rumoured to have produced a son, Alexei Bobrinsky, who was raised as nobility and eventually ennobled by her grandson. In true Russian fashion, the truth was hidden behind layers of courtly silence, poisoned tea, and very confusing church paperwork. Let's talk about the weirdest one, Peter the Great, also of Russia. He had a daughter, Elizabeth, who later became Empress, but he also fathered numerous children with mistresses, including a Swedish prisoner of war named Marta, who became his wife under the name Catherine the Worse. One of her children's origins was so murky that court historians practically held their quills in mid-air, unsure whether to record her as royal or a lucky accident. Royal blood, after all, could be very elastic, as long as you didn't ask too many questions. And it wasn't just kings. Royal women also had illegitimate children, though the stakes were much higher and deadlier for them. While a king might be applauded for spreading his seed, a queen caught with a baby that didn't match her husband's timeline risked everything. The most whispered about case, Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, the English-born sister of King George III. She allegedly had a passionate affair with the royal physician Johann Struensee, which resulted in a child, Princess Louise Auguste. The child was legally the daughter of the king, but everyone at court whispered that she was definitely Struensee's. The lovers were discovered, Struensee was executed, and Caroline was exiled. There's also the case of Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, who had a rumoured affair with her bodyguard after the death of her husband, King Ferdinand. She gave birth to a child in secret, had the records altered, and then married the bodyguard in what was one of the most quietly scandalous moves in royal history. Imagine being the second queen in line, with a bodyguard turned husband and a baby that half of the palace pretends doesn't exist. Talk about plot twists. Fringe fact of the night. In 18th century Prussia, it was rumoured that some royal bastards were hidden away in military orphanages, raised as officers with no knowledge of their birthright. This was considered practical, and gave them discipline, a profession, and kept them far from inheritance claims. So yes, there's a chance a Prussian general yelling at infantry in 1790 was secretly the king's half-brother. Illegitimacy wasn't just about sex, it was about succession, secrecy, and scandal management. Some bastards were raised like princes, others were buried in anonymity, but in every generation there was always one or two that made it into the sunlight, often with a nose just a little too similar to someone on a coin. Today, DNA tests are starting to crack these stories open. Centuries-old rumours confirmed. Royal families that suddenly need to answer awkward questions. You'd think the age of the royal love child had passed, but even now, whispers still slip through the velvet. And now, from secrets to spotlights, we end this sensual parade in the modern world, where royalty is still tangled in lust, lies, and late-night texts. Because as it turns out, palace walls can't keep out Instagram. And here you are, modern day. The chandeliers have been replaced with flash bulbs. The love letters are now texts that somehow always get leaked. And royal scandal no longer needs a palace. It needs a tabloid, a camera phone, and a hashtag. Welcome to the era of modern royals, old habits, where lust still lingers in royal veins, but now it's stitched with PR disasters, online outrage, and the ever-present dread of being cancelled before tea. You'd think after centuries of drama, royal families would have learned to keep it in their trousers. But no, apparently noble blood can't resist a little late-night sin. Let's start with the biggest stage. The British royal family, aka the soap opera that refuses to end. We all know the highlight reels. The fairy tale wedding of Princess Diana and Prince Charles that turned out to be more grim than Disney. Diana, the shy nursery assistant turned global icon, stepped into the spotlight and was promptly left in the cold by a husband who was already emotionally tangled with Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles and Camilla had been friends since the early 70s, but their emotional and eventually physical affair ran hot and hidden behind palace curtains for decades. Then came the leak. The infamous Tampongate call in 1993, a recording of an intimate, cringingly personal phone conversation between Charles and Camilla, in which he says he wants to live inside her trousers and jokes about becoming a tampon. Yes, that happened. A future king saying that. It was scandalous, absurd, and deeply embarrassing. The press feasted on it like vultures at a royal banquet. Public trust plummeted. Diana, meanwhile, gave her own bombshell interview where she famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Fringe fact? After Diana's tragic death, conspiracy theories sprouted like mould in a palace basement. Some still believe her death in a Paris tunnel wasn't an accident, but a carefully orchestrated erasure. No proof, just a lot of whispers, and a public that refused to let go of the woman who made monarchy human. Fast forward, and we get Prince Harry, Diana's youngest son, rebellious, red-haired, and carrying the emotional baggage of 1,000 press photographers. His early years were classic tabloid fodder, Vegas strip poker, Nazi costumes, yes, that one, and nightclub brawls. But then came Meghan Markle, the American actress who walked into the monarchy like a Molotov cocktail in Louboutins. Their love story was swift, sweet, and wildly controversial. Meghan was biracial, divorced, confident, and the British tabloids lost their minds. Accusations flew, headlines veered into racism. Meghan was accused of being manipulative, too modern, too opinionated, too alive. The couple fled to California, detonated a nuclear-level interview with Oprah, and have since spilled royal tea across multiple platforms. Netflix, memoirs, and probably your neighbour's group chat. Their exit wasn't just scandal. It was the evolution of royal desire, not about sex, but sovereignty. The right to marry who you love, to raise your children outside the royal fishbowl, to not be chewed up and spit out by tradition. It was messy, but it was also historic. Diana would have nodded. Unless you think it's just the Brits misbehaving, allow us to cast our gaze at King Juan Carlos V of Spain, who abdicated in 2014 after years of sex scandals, financial misdeeds, and one especially tasteless photo of him posing with an elephant he had just shot, while the Spanish economy collapsed. But the real scandal? His reported string of mistresses, including Corinna Larson, a businesswoman who claimed he gifted her over $65 million out of gratitude and love. It sounded romantic until Spanish courts started sniffing around and found a lot more than love letters. Think offshore accounts, hidden funds, and a king so embarrassed he now lives in exile in Abu Dhabi. Meanwhile, Prince Albert of Monaco, son of Grace Kelly, has spent his entire adult life dodging paternity suits like they were tennis balls. He has at least 2 confirmed illegitimate children, acknowledged only after serious legal pressure. He eventually married former Olympian Charlene Whitstock, but not before she allegedly tried to flee the country multiple times before their wedding, once getting caught at the airport. Romantic. Modern royalty tries hard to look polished now. Crisp tailoring, scripted interviews, carefully filtered Instagram pages. But scratch the surface and the lust, longing, and poor decision-making are all still there, just updated for Wi-Fi. Take the Thai royal family, where King Vajiralongkorn made international headlines for naming a royal noble consort in 2019, a move that revived the medieval practice of officially recognising a mistress. That consort, Sininat Wong-Vajirapakdi, was later stripped of all titles for disloyalty, disappeared from public view, and then mysteriously reappeared months later with her titles restored. It was a royal love story reimagined as a Bond film. Fringe fact: during COVID lockdowns, King Vajiralongkorn allegedly quarantined in a luxury Bavarian hotel with a harem of 20 women. Not exactly a Zoom call and banana bread situation. And let's not forget Japan, where the Imperial family is so rigid that Princess Mako gave up her title altogether to marry her college sweetheart. Why? Because he was a commoner. And their engagement caused a years-long national uproar involving tabloid smear campaigns, legal disputes and family drama that would have made Netflix foam at the mouth. She traded the chrysanthemum throne for a one-bedroom apartment in New York. Sometimes love means giving up everything, including your face on the money. So what does all this tell us? That royal lust never really changes. Thrones rise and fall, but the urge to sneak away for something forbidden, someone who makes you feel real or wild or seen, that remains. From Versailles to Vegas, from silk bedsheets to Buckingham balconies, sex has always been the most powerful force behind the scenes. Not always pretty, rarely simple, but always human. And you? You made it through it all. From ancient orgies to TikTok scandals, you peeked behind every curtain, opened every gilded bedroom door, and followed the tangled sheets all the way from Caesar to Sussex. Now, take a deep breath. Time to wind down. The palace lights are dim now. The silk sheets have cooled. Somewhere, a crown sits crooked on a velvet pillow, and the halls are finally quiet. All the whispered love affairs, the jealous mistresses, the forbidden letters, the royal babies born in shadow, they're part of a story older than any throne. One where desire writes history as much as war ever did. You've walked through centuries of secrets. You've seen kings undone by kisses, queens exiled for love, emperors shattered by the touch of a hand they could never own. And in the end, maybe that's the real legacy of royalty. Not just power, but the way they fall apart when they chase something they're told they can't have. So now, close your eyes. Let the perfume fade. Let the curtains close, and let the soft sound of scandal settle into silence.